On May 17th, 2016, if you open the New York Times, you would say, I'm reading a really credible paper. It's the New York Times, so the average person in the United States who doesn't have time to spend hours doing research assumes that the New York Times is probably pretty accurate and they should trust it. So the article says, front page article says, genetically engineered crops are safe, analysis finds. And it goes on to say, genetically engineered crops appear to be safe to eat and do not harm the environment, according to a comprehensive new analysis by the advisory group, the National Academics of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. However, it is unclear whether the technology has actually increased crop yields. The report from the influential group released on Tuesday comes as the federal government is reviewing how it regulates biotech crops, and as big packaged food companies like Campbell Soup and General Mills are starting to label products as being made with genetically engineered ingredients to comply with the new Vermont law. The report also says that new techniques, like a way to make a small genetic change in plants using genome editing, are blurring the distinction between genetic engineering and conventional plant breeding, making the existing regulatory system untenable. It calls for a new system that pays more attention to the attributes of the crop as opposed to the way it was created. Despite its roughly 400 pages, however, the document is not expected to end the highly polarized dispute over biotech crops, which are often called GMOs for genetically modified organisms. Both sides on Tuesday pointed approvingly to findings that buttressed their viewpoint and criticized those that did not. And it goes on to speak a little more, and then a little bit later down it goes, this is the latest of several reports on genetically modified crops by the National Academies, which are private nonprofit organizations set up by Congress to give advice on issues related to science, technology, and medicine. A previous report by the groups released in 2010 found that genetic engineering had provided environmental and economic benefits to American farmers. The new report was written by a committee of 20, almost all of them from academia. There was no one from crop biotechnology companies like Monsanto or DuPont on the committee, though some members have developed genetically engineered crops and might have been consultant to the companies. The committee examined more than 1,000 studies, heard testimony from 80 witnesses in a series of public meetings and webinars, and analyzed 700 comments submitted by the public. The committee concentrated its review on the genetically engineered crops that account for the vast bulk of such plants grown in the United States. And it went on to say a few more things, and that was it. So, if you were a reasonable person, an intelligent person, you would say, I just read the New York Times, which everyone tells me is a really quality newspaper. They just said that an advisory group called the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine made this decision. How could any reasonable person come to any conclusion other than they're safe, they're good? The New York Times, the good paper, is quoting a government agency that specializes in giving advice. So it's a done deal. There's nothing more to think about. Now, I don't know how many thousands of times a similar situation has happened, where a credible newspaper quotes what sounds like a credible organization. We all believe it, and all your friends believe it, and your family believes it, and that's how we develop our belief systems. So that was the end of the story. There was nothing more to say. I was thinking to myself, wow, that doesn't make sense compared to what I've been reading, but what else is there to say? But in this one particular case, not normally, but this one particular case, I got another thing by email about 5 days later. And this was from a group called Food and Water Watch. And Food and Water Watch says, just wanted to comment on that New York Times article. And this is what they said. The National Research Council, the research arm of the National Academy of Sciences, enjoys a reputation as one of the elite scientific bodies in the United States, an independent institution that Congress calls on for impartial scientific advice about topics like genetically engineered crops. However, here we go, the NRC's far-reaching ties to biotechnology companies and other agricultural corporations have created conflicts of interest at every level of the organization, which greatly diminish the independence and integrity of the NRC's scientific work. Among other conflicts, Food and Water Watch found that the NRC and its parent organization, the National Academy of Science, takes millions of dollars in funding from biotechnology companies, invites sponsors like Monsanto to sit on high-level boards overseeing the NRC's work, invites industry-aligned pro-GMO scientists to author NRC reports, draws scientific conclusions based on industry science, operate at times as a private contractor for private research. And then the kicker is they go, okay, here is the list of the 23 people who are on this board who made this decision, and they go on to explain what their relation, and of the 23 people, you've got 14 people with direct financial ties to the biotech industry. In other words, the first person, researcher collaborator with Monsanto, Bayer, Dow AgroSciences. Second person, consulted for Dow AgroSciences and Syngenta, parents on GMOs. Third person, consulted for Monsanto 4 times, received more than $1 million from biotech industry for research patents on GMOs. Fourth person, works for organizations sponsored by Monsanto and Bayer. Fifth person, consults with Monsanto-sponsored organizations and a pro-GMO group. Fifth person. Sixth person, director of research center funded by biotech industry. Sixth person, patents on GMOs, engages in pro-GMO political advocacy. Okay, could keep going down the list. So here we are. The New York Times every day has stories that I believe. They quote groups that we all trust. The whole public believes it. And in this one case, we happen to get the inside that this impartial advisory group of 23 people has 14 people with direct financial ties to the biotech industry. So I don't know how anyone knows anything, because half the stuff we're getting information that is completely biased. So that is the opening story, and I'd like for you guys to each make your opening comment and give me your thought on this story, and then how you see, is this a one-off, that this is the only time this happened? And this is the only time I was ever able to see it so clearly, but please give me your experience, each of you.
No, that's not a one-off. Thank you. Stephen Drucker, the author of Altered Genes, Twisted Truth, said, "The aggregate frauds that have been perpetrated on behalf of genetically modified foods constitute by far the biggest fraud in the history of science." And the article that Stephen just read from the New York Times is more of that fraud. It's time for us to stop thinking of our news sources, the media sources, as news, because they're not. As I talked about the other day when I was talking about vaccines, we need to go beyond the product and look at the people behind the product. And it applies equally to GMOs as it does to vaccines. And the people behind the product are fraudsters, and there's a whole lot of other words that we can use to describe them. And the media is bought. It's time to stop thinking of the U.S. government as our government, because the government is deeply, deeply connected to the GMO industry. The USDA has hundreds of patents in its own name, and it spends hundreds of millions of dollars on GMO research to get more patents. The U.S. government is heavily invested in perpetrating, disseminating GMO foods around the world, and I don't believe it's to feed the world. I believe it's a bioweapon, because if you can control the world's food, you control the world, and I believe that foreign policy is based on food insecurity, and a foreign policy that's based on food insecurity will surely reap negative results that could come back and bite us and bite our children very, very hard.
Just let me clarify. I might have said 14 out of 23. There were 22 members on the board, and 12 of them had ties to the biotech industry.
40 years ago, I had the fortune to live in Europe for 3.5 years, and lived in a freedomistic atmosphere for natural and complementary health care. And I have an ongoing relationship with Europe. I'll be there in 3 weeks again, and they're usually a month to 2 months every year, and started to see a complete collapse and then a fascist approach to natural health care. And I would come back to the United States, and I've gotten to know some pretty important people in powerful positions in the natural health field who are endowed economically, and started to preach to them 15 years ago about this is going to be exported to America, that we're going to have the Kodaks come over here, they're going to force genetic modification on us. This is what's happening in Germany and in France. And of course, all the wealthy people waved the flag and told me, no, it's not true. And so my nonprofit organization, Hippocrates is a nonprofit, found the right lobbyist in Washington. She actually is a woman who wrote something called the Duché Act that has so far protected Americans' rights to take supplements. Because if that act wasn't in place, that happened in the 1990s, you would not be able to take supplements, as they cannot anymore in many of these European countries, anything of significance. And so we hired lobbyists, and so we know not what's written in the New York Times, but what's going on in the deepest, darkest halls of Congress and the Senate on an ongoing basis. A good part of what I do is that, and have for almost a decade now. And what I can say to you is that this is one circumstance where they were caught with their pants down. I would imagine that almost every single time we look at this closely, you're going to find the same bedfellows. That the people that are supposed to be the elite, the academic, the non-touchable, as we call, are almost consistently and always in bed with or paid directly by the industries they're protecting. This is the way your government in the United States works, your governments in Europe work, South America, worldwide, and Asia slowly but surely is falling into this trap also at this point. So what I'm going to say to you is that, and I completely concur with you, that this is no longer your government. Wherever you are in the world, it's most likely where you live, it's no longer your government. It's a government of special interest at this point. This is corporate fascism. And I'll repeat what I said to you. Corporate fascism. They are forcing you to buy, purchase deadly, dangerous products that not only harm you and your loved ones, but humanity on a whole and the planet Earth. And unless we are informed and ethical, information's not anything unless you put it into practice. Informed and ethical, this will continue, it will get worse, and seemingly these people are willing to go to their death in the pursuit of economics, sacrifice their own loved ones in the pursuit of economics. Just look at the work of my friend and colleague Jeffrey Smith. Anyone that would read just in a scattering of what he's done on genetic modification knows that it creates disease. Sit where I am in my chair with people that are sick almost on a daily basis, and compared to what it was like before genetic modification, and diseases like irritable bowel syndrome today, and neurological problems today, etc. Cancers today are in a big, big upswing. So I'm glad we're discussing this tonight. Be aware, become informed, but most important, be ethical.
I would say that people should not worship the New York Times. You know, there are a lot of people that do. They think they're so special because they read the Times every day and they can quote the Times every day. But I think you need to be very careful about accepting New York Times as God. And I want to give an example. In my talks, both my talks here, I've talked about this report called the IAASTD, which was a 4-year report done by the UN. I think 70 countries were involved in researching it about how we're going to feed the world in the future. And what they said was that basically sustainable, agroecological, organic methods should feed the world. We don't need GMOs. It went on and on about it. And in my film, Hans Herren was the co-chair of it. And that came out, and before it came out, the United States worked on it, but because they didn't say GMOs are the answer, they said GMOs are there, but that's not really how we're going to feed the world and help the world feed itself, which is really what we should be doing. The United States refused to sign on to it, even though they'd worked on it. I think the United States and Canada were the only two countries that worked on it that refused to sign on to it. So it was a big deal when it came out a few years ago. It was a very, very big deal all over the planet. The New York Times didn't even report on it. They didn't even mention it until, I think, a couple of years later, when someone wrote an editorial, it might have been Hans Herren, an editorial that mentioned it, like a guest editorial, you know, it wasn't by the paper. And so, you know, they represent the vested interests. They, you know, I've talked to reporters from the New York Times, and they have a very, you know, even their whole health thing, Jane Brody, she was totally against vitamins forever, you know, totally against, I mean, it's just a very establishment and kind of elitist newspaper, and a lot of progressive, or I don't know, call it the progressive liberals, they want to say that GMOs are a done deal. You know, it's a done deal, it's accepted all over the world, you know, resistance is futile, it's over, the consensus is in, let's move on. And as I've said in my talk, that's absolutely not true. Most of the world has not accepted it, they've rejected it, they don't want it, they're trying to shove it down Africa's throat, Africa's saying no, Europe has said no, Russia says no, they won't grow it. So, you know, it's part of this sort of neo-colonial mentality of America coming in with its patented seeds and trying to basically take over the agricultural, you know, systems of the world and control the food system. So I think that one of the only good thing, and tell me when that came out, Steve. What was the date on that? May. Okay, so they were voting on this thing called the Dark Act, where they were trying to make sure that Vermont, you know, July 1st, Vermont, the labeling bill was going to come into Vermont, and the forces that wanted GMOs, that didn't want labeling because they don't want it labeled, they were trying to do everything they could to make sure that that actually didn't happen. So what they did is they concocted this thing that's called, we call it the Dark Act, denying Americans the right to know, where it's labeling, but it's labeling if you have a smartphone. They have 2 years to decide how to do it. And if you have a smartphone, you can put it up next to the square, and that'll take you to a website where you can check and see if that's which they own, which they can check and see. You can check and see if that's GMO, you know. And they have 2 years to do it, and they also redefine GMOs, so it's certainly possible that most of the things that are GMO now won't even be listed as GMO. So they were trying all kinds of propaganda techniques to promote the idea. No reason to label them, everything's fine, scientists love it, et cetera, et cetera. They had another thing where they had over 100 scientists, Nobel Prize winners, saying GMOs were great. None of them had any experience in agronomy or agriculture or anything, totally bogus. These are propaganda things designed to come out to sway Congress to pass the Dark Act. That's what this is all about. The one good thing about that report is it says in it that GMOs do not create higher yields. So why are we growing it? Why are we poisoning, why are we putting, you know, billions of pounds of Roundup all over the place that is in Europe seen as a probable carcinogen? You know, GMOs are a failed technology. They're supposed to, you know, you're supposed to spray Roundup and it destroys the weeds. Now we have super weeds. It doesn't destroy the weeds. So it doesn't even work. So they're trying to really gloss that over with this, you know, fake expertise. And you know, they are vested interests. Even the scientists that did this other report, you know, the guys were running biotech companies. They were medical biotech, but still, they don't want the whole idea of people challenging anything to do with biotech. So I think that you find a lot more information out. Food and Water Watch is a good organization. Organic Consumers, good organization.
Jacobs.
Center for Food Safety, which I'm on the board of. And it's just, there are a lot of good organizations out there. Consumers Union, Michael Hansen, their chief scientist, has been dedicated to becoming aware of what GMOs are really all about. And it's basically the pesticide industry bought the seed industry. So they want to promote a technology that needs their pesticides, which creates a sick system, so you need more pesticides. So it's, and Roundup doesn't work, and so they approved this 2,4-D, which is, was an Agent Orange, and so they approved that, but then there were lawsuits, and so the EPA pulled it back, so now they can't use it. But the resistance to GMOs is growing in the United States and all over the world, and they are afraid of that. So what they just say is, everything's fine, consensus is in, done deal, moving along. And it's absolutely bullshit. So I think, you have to, I think we have to inform ourselves and understand how this technology works, understand what the sociological implications are of having a few, now there's 3, they've all joined. Now we learned today Bayer is gonna buy Monsanto. 3 multinational corporations, pesticide companies that control the seed supply. It couldn't be more dangerous. And I think we need to resist.
Yes, it could, because now we have a medical company, Bayer, owning the pesticide company that owns the seed.
Well, that's right. I'm saying it couldn't be. It will.
It got worse.
I mean, I'm saying, but it will. But I meant to say,
it couldn't be
what
any
I'm saying,
worse.
it couldn't be more dangerous. We couldn't find a worse situation to be in, is what I'm trying to say. But I think that it's important to understand what the mainstream thinking is, and I think it's also really important for people, liberals, who say that we need genetic engineering to feed the world, and now I don't want to think about it anymore because I've got so many other problems. I just want that one to be off my plate. Is we don't need GMOs to feed the world. Yields are lower, and we contaminate the land. Disease, they find all kinds of problems. You look at, they say these things have been tested, all these studies. Well, you look at what the studies were. They're, does this die when I spray it with Roundup? Or how much does this field grow? It's not health studies. No human health studies have been done in this country. And you look at what the studies they've done, they do the studies, the corporations do the studies themselves, they summarize the results and they hand them into the government, and the government says, see, you've done some tests. Nobody's responsible. Nobody's being held accountable. So I think that, because resistance and anger about this is rising, and anger at corporations who are trying to control our lives and our food supply is rising, they really want to calm everybody down, and we've got the experts telling it's okay, but don't believe it. I think we need to inform ourselves, and I think this is a great forum to be able to do that in.
Well, to sum up, because I don't think there's too much more to say. I mean, when you read an article, first of all, let me back up a second. I'm a garden columnist. I write an article every single week and have for 41 years. And let me tell you, yeah, I think I mentioned, yes, I do so that nobody robs my house because I don't want to be on vacation. So what happened, and I have one that's going in the paper this week, and I'm not there, but don't tell anybody. You can write anything you want. And you can spin stuff like no one's business. And, most of the time, nobody has any idea what the hell you're doing or why you're doing it. Now, in this particular instance, if I was reading that particular article, the first thing that would hit me is, wait a second, they didn't do any studies on their own.
That's right.
These guys sat around in a nice hotel room with nice, good, expensive snacks and everything, and they wrote a report, and then they had a little trip to Hawaii to finalize it up, and they didn't do one study. So we know the studies that they did review were studies that were done by Monsanto and Dow Chemical, and they were these 90-day studies on what happens to a rat, or blah, blah, blah. So I would be really concerned about that. That would ring a bell right away, even though it was the New York Times, maybe especially because it was the New York Times. And then I would say to myself, now, wait a second. The other thing is, wait. So they're only going to industry studies. This is like the cannabis industry, right, trying to get Schedule 2 instead of Schedule 1. And the DEA says, all the studies that you're allowed to do on cannabis for the past 40 years have had to be a negative result. So then when they're deciding whether or not to take it from Schedule 1 to Schedule 2, they say, gee, there are no studies that have a positive result. Well, because you wouldn't let anybody do any of them. So, you know, what does that mean? It means nothing. It was just a stupid, and it's the same thing in this particular instance. It means nothing. And if you read the New York Times, you know, you got to sit and then get you know, something from a Jeffrey Smith or what you got. You have to sit there and think to yourself, this is one of those things where for the past, since 1996, for every time something bad is said about a GMO, every time there's a study by a Dr. Huber or whomever it might be, there are 5 or 6 of these industry things come and say, that's wrong, that's wrong, that's wrong. You know, and if you, anything when you read the New York Times, you have to sit there and say, I can't figure this out. There's not enough information in the New York Times to be able to figure it out. And that's the bottom line if you're reading the New York Times. If I read that story, I would say, I can't figure this out. I know who these guys are. They don't sound like they're good guys. I know the studies aren't real studies. You know, I know they didn't do the studies. I know the Dark Act is coming up. I know they're concerned about Vermont. Goodness gracious, you know. And I know the New York Times probably shouldn't have written this story, and I know the reporter probably didn't have the faintest goddamn idea what he or she was reading. And really, we probably ought to report this to the ombudsman and see whether they'll write something about it and make a controversy and write a letter to the New York Times. But too late now, because it was in May.
Before we move to the next subject, let me make a comment. Both of these wonderful people spoke about the Dark Act. We only, what that really was, is they wanted to take your rights away as an American citizen to know that food has genetic modified organisms in it. And we only won by 1 vote, because we pressed, lobbied, and pressed. And one night when you're sleeping, I assure you, they're going to revote. They're messing with it now. The lobbyists have told me this last week, and so they're going to try to sneak something in.
Just to clarify, didn't we lose the dark vote?
No.
Well, the Dark Act is a labeling act, but the labeling is...
It's part of it.
The labeling, you have to have a smartphone. They don't really know, but probably it's going to be a smartphone, or it takes you to a website, or you go to a website. But the real problem in it is that it's redefined what GMOs are in a way that may actually mean they don't have to label Roundup Ready crops and food anymore.
Correct.
That's what Michael Hansen told me.
Punchline.
So that's the problem. It's it's actually worse. You know, the final bill that they voted on was actually worse than we imagined it would be, because they put this thing in it that's very confusing about what GMOs really are.
There's one other thing about that New York Times article. It didn't mention any weeds, did it? No. I didn't see the word weeds in there. I'm not talking about cannabis again. They didn't say anything about the weeds. Now, if there's one thing we know, whether you're a scientist or not, you can walk into a GMO field and see the super weeds. You can see them. You can pick them up and say, holy crow, look at this weed. This is a super weed. You know what it is. But there's nothing in there about super weeds. Now, they can't be good. They are a result of using GMO, period. You know, they wouldn't be there if we weren't using GMO. Are they GMO themselves? No, maybe not. They might be, actually, because the DNA transfers, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, that's what happens down in the soil, and the bacteria pass it on and everything else. And that's the other thing. All of a sudden, I would probably be sitting in the bathroom about 2 or 3 hours after having read that article, you know, thinking again, oh, God, my life is so dull. I got to give a talk about microbes, and start thinking about microbes again, and then start thinking about the microbes in the soil, and then realize, wait a second, I happen to know that GMO DNA is transferring into the bacteria in this. Wait a minute, that wasn't in that article. Wait a minute, you mean to tell me those scientists sitting around there that was so smart, if they're not advising Lisa Murkowski, my senator, I'm going to go talk to her, because they're idiots. And Senator Murkowski's concerned about GMO salmon, because we live in Alaska and we don't want GMO salmon. So wait a second. You know what I'm saying? So these kinds of things. We got 2 people on this panel, by the way, who are from Alaska, and she happens to be a very powerful individual on the Natural Resources Committee. In fact, I think she's the ranking Republican. And so what we're going to do, I'm just going to say right now, is we're going to go and beat her up a little bit. But we won't have to. We won't have to, because she's a mother, and she's an Alaskan, and she understands what they're trying to do with genetically modified fish. But that's a whole nother conference. We're not talking.
Frankenfish.
Frankenfish.
Yeah.
I'd like to comment on that just a little bit. When my family finished running across the country in 2014, we finished back east, and we went into Lisa Murkowski's office, and we met with her. And I don't want to disparage her in any way, because she does a lot of good work. And she made it very clear that she was adamantly opposed to GMO salmon, of course, because that would negatively impact the Alaska fisheries. But her comment was that that corn doesn't swim, and it just really irked me, because it's true, corn doesn't swim, but pollen, yeah, not yet, thank you, but corn has pollen, and the wind blows, and I thought, you know, it all comes down to protecting your own and not offending those who are not part of your own. And you know, you got to play the political game, but we're not concerned about the political game. We're concerned about our children. We're concerned about the environment. We're concerned about the truth.
But I will say that GMO salmon is going to be labeled.
The Dark Act changed that.
I think there was an amendment to an appropriation bill that kind of changed that. But I could be wrong, but we'll see.
I read that the labeling of GMO salmon got kicked out with the Dark Act.
Let's see what our powerful senator does, and then if she does it, let's leverage it. Because
well, let me give you the optimistic side of this. Companies are waiting in line to establish the label on their mainstream products that we don't have genetic modification in it, because wonderful people who have worked in this subject before I knew what a genetic modification was literally took the public in the United States, and I can only speak about these numbers, from 3% knowing what it was and being against it to almost 67% knowing what it is and being against it. So they can make all the laws they want, but at the end of the day, we're the people that have purchase power, and we can say no. And if all of you listening in this room and around the world, around the globe, say no and only purchase non-genetically modified organic food, they go out of business. And that's the best way to beat them. Put them out of business.
Think you're a savvy grocery shopper? Do the thousands of products from different brands give you all the choice you need? Turns out the average grocery store doesn't have nearly as many choices as you think. The top companies controlled on average 62.8% of the sales of 100 types of groceries. In 30 categories, 4 or fewer companies controlled at least 75% of the sales. In 6 categories, the top companies sold more than 90% of the category sales, including baby formula and microwave dinners. Many firms sell multiple brands of the same product, which leads consumers to believe they are choosing among competitors when they are actually just choosing among products made by the same firm that may have been made at the same factory. It's even true for organic and healthful brands, which are increasingly being bought by large companies. For example, Kellogg's owns both Kashi and Bare Naked brands, even though their packaging and websites make them seem different. So hold on one second, if there's anything else on that one. Want to comment on that?
These manufacturers, they all belong, or nearly all of them, I would guess. I'm not sure about all of them, but they belong to the Grocery Manufacturers Association, which is ardently ardently pro-GMO, and they spend a lot of money. They poured a lot of money into Prop 37 in California back in 2013. They poured a lot of money surreptitiously in what was the name of the bill in Washington, that the labeling bill there that was defeated, and it came out that the donors to defeat that bill were hidden somehow behind the machinations of that, and I can't remember how that happened, but yeah, if you're part of the Grocery Manufacturers Association, that's an organization that is essentially anti-consumer, because consumers do want to know what's in their food, and the only reason the GMO scam, if you will, can prosper is based on consumer ignorance. When we ran across the country, we met maybe half a dozen people in 3,000 miles that opposed what we were doing, opposed our mission. And everyone else either knew about it and were opposed to GMOs, or when they heard about it from us, mind you, we're very biased, so they got the straight scoop from us, but they said, "You're kidding me, they put this stuff and it really does this," and yeah, that's what it really does. And of course they opposed it. So the only way GMOs can thrive in a capitalistic society like this is in ignorance. Because when people really find out what's in it, they won't buy it. And some have noted that a true GMO label is a skull and crossbones to the industry, and that's why they have spent millions in the United States to make sure that we don't have labeling, because this is the cradle of GMO technology. And if we don't accept it, the rest of the world would say, whoa, if they don't accept it. And they've most of the rest of the world has already put up their hand and said, no, thank you, we're not taking that. So it thrives in ignorance. By talking about it tonight, we decrease that ignorance, and again, it's coming to a head with more and more people knowing about it, more and more people wanting to know the truth, and the kickback with them saying, no, you're not allowed to know the truth. And eventually that leads to revolution in whatever form that may take.
Yeah, I want to say that my film, The Future of Food, came out 12 years ago, which was the first film to really let people know about the GMO regime. And no one knew about it then. And now, you know, because of my work and lots of people's work, Jeffrey Smith's work, your work, everything, you know, a lot of people know about it. But when you talk about the food companies and the food that's in the grocery stores, if you actually look at what's in that food, it's basically wheat, refined wheat, corn syrup, lecithin, you know, that sugar beets, which are GMO. It's not healthy food. That's not, those corporations, it's all the same few ingredients in these cereals and, you know, these kinds of things. It's not food that people should be eating. People should be eating vegetables and whole foods and good foods. They should be eating foods that they prepare themselves. Those are mostly prepared foods. They're you know, they're not, they're the kind of food that are creating diabetes and all these heart problems. It's not good food. But, you know, it's like, I have to say, I go in I do shop at, you know, healthy food stores. But when I go to a store like, you know, like a big grocery store, it's a regular grocery store, I mean, I can go down aisle after aisle after aisle and not find a single thing that I actually would want to eat.
Exactly.
And so it's not real food. So I think that claiming that they control the food system, they control certain aspects of the food system in places where people have no other choice about what to buy. But when people do have a choice about what to buy, they want to buy fruits and vegetables and, you know, healthier things, I think. And farmers markets and that whole thing and CSAs. I mean, people, it's not just on the coast that people are doing that. They're doing that all over the country. They love it. And that's another thing, and that's why these stores, you know, they're all trying to, they set up their entryway and everything just like Whole Foods. You know, they see what Whole Foods does, and they set theirs up the same way with the plants and all this kind of stuff. So it's deceptive, because I think that there really is this movement. I sort of hate calling it a food movement because it sounds like snobby Berkeley food, but people are more and more concerned about what they eat and wanting to feel better, and of course they want to look better, and they want to feel like they're part of something and not just in this giant, you know, fluorescent lit grocery store where there's, you know, like the same cereal over and over again. So I think it's, you know, it's what seems like is happening, what's promoted in the media is happening, is actually very, very different than what's really happening in communities and on farms. Young people, you know, the cool thing for young people to do, and it's been this way for several years, is to, you know, be farmers or interns on farms or have these little artisan food things that they love and make a living at. So there's a movement going on that's very, very different than what it would seem like if you look at the mainstream media about what's happening in the food system.
Point in fact, Stephen, all of the efforts that were put forth, you included, in California, and we lost, in part was because those industries spent 10 times more money. And they had doctors, of course, somehow people are still under the trance of mainstream doctors, said, you know, this is not going to help you in any way and it's going to cost you more money. So they hit the pocketbook. And just tonight, before I came down to speak, I was reading today's economic report, which was amazingly good, by the way. The United States has grown economically more than in the entire time that they've had the economic scale together. But then they compared, where was that happening? Is it happening in metropolitan areas? Yes, but it's not happening in the farmlands, because these evil companies basically have multinational farms, and the little farmers are going out of business, and there's no more work for them. So what we did in the Hippocrates magazine, Healing Our World, is I actually took a lot of the health food companies that many of you probably eat these products globally, and had two lists and their logos. The list of people who supported labeling, the good guys, and on this side, the health food companies who actually deceptively put money in to stop labeling. And these are companies that call themselves often organic companies and natural food companies. And that list was pretty formidable, I'll tell you right now. Because what Stephen just said, and I think it was really the punchline of his question, is correct. That slowly but surely this big money comes in and they suck everything up. When I was a hippie in the 60s, we thought we were going to change the world. They actually bought that. They commercialize that even. There's nothing they don't eventually get a hold of and commercialize. So you've got to stay, as Anna always says, 5 steps ahead of them. You've got to five steps ahead. Never ever get comfortable with an institutionalized movement. Be happy that you have community, but institutionalize your own movement and make it movable. Because you're a moving target, it's much harder to get.
What is different? A lot of people who are not paying attention to this, not studying this, they think food is food. It's always been the same way. So what are you saying is different about food today in 2016 than what was going on 100 years ago? What's the difference in the food and the way it's made? What's different about it?
I am not going to make a long, eloquent statement here because all three of these people will do far better than I will do, but you made the statement, food is food, and Monsanto actually has a quote, and that is, a seed is a seed. Think about that. When it's Monsanto telling people that what they've done, what they've created in their laboratories is the same as what nature or
Tell them about what happens at Monsanto meetings and at the boards. What do they eat at the Monsanto meetings?
I'm going to put it down and you guys can take over. Thank you.
Okay, you go ahead and tell.
I think they eat organic.
They
I
do.
think they eat organic. They
food.
don't have GMOs in their cafeteria. But I think the main thing, Vilsack, he's very pro-GMO. And I know that some friend of mine saw him in Washington buying organic milk,
Yeah.
So I got to question Vilsack at a conference in Washington. And I said, he was talking about how he likes to talk about organic and GMO. He says, Crazy Secretary of Agriculture, he says, I have 2 children and I love them equally. And so he pulled that line. I said, I was talking about you, and he said, I have 2 children and I love them equally. And I said, with all due respect, one of your children is a bully. And he goes, what? What? He said, no, that's the problem. We can all get along. We can get along. We should get, 20 or 30 people in a room and we can solve this. We can live together. And I said, well, except if you have GMO and organic fields next to each other, the GMO will contaminate the organic. So actually, we can't get along together. Anyway, and then your time is up, your time is up. But I think one of the main things that's changed in the mainstream industry is that so many things are processed. And so I think it's that they've taken the life out of the food, and that a lot of processed foods are the foods that have GMOs in it, because they have corn syrup and lecithin and that sort of thing. And I also want to say that another thing about the GMOs is that 15 years ago they were promoting that we're going to have GMO wheat, we're going to have GMO rice, and there have been a few products, there is GMO alfalfa and GMO sugar beet, but they have not had GMO rice or GMO wheat. And when there are fields that have been contaminated you know, if they find that, now they've recently found some GMO wheat that contaminated regular wheat, and you know, the markets just freak out, and Japan closes the door, and and South Korea closes the door, and everybody freaks out, and they stop imports from the United States, and so they're not taking it. So we don't have GMO wheat, and they've stopped talking about bringing it out, and we don't have GMO rice, and we probably won't, because the wheat growers and the rice growers don't want it because they know they'll lose their markets. And that's why these trade deals are so dangerous. The TPP and the one in Europe is because part of what they could do is say, well, you have this investor state rights where a corporation can sue our government for restricting it from making money, and say, you know, you're restricting us from making money by not letting us have our GMO rice and wheat come in your country, so you owe us all the profits we could have made if we could bring that in your country. That's what they would do. So I think that it's important to fight these things on all kinds of levels, and also make people aware of what the consequences are of some of these sort of underhanded schemes are to really basically take it over.
I forgot what I was going to say.
That happens to all of us.
What is different about fish today for someone who is saying, I'm just going to have a piece of fish, my grandmother ate fish and my great-grandmother ate fish, it's fish, leave me alone. Is there any difference in fish today than there used to be, than great-grandma's fish?
Yes, but I should probably let the guy from Sitka talk. But yeah, you know, if you eat farm fish, you're eating fish that's eating shit that they throw at it, you know, and probably is shit, frankly. You know, it's chicken feed and, you know, things that fish don't eat. And they keep them in these little pens with all their urine and feces in it and all the bacteria and everything else. There's no fresh water. It's a terrible, disgusting thing. Alaskans, whenever we go to a restaurant and we're in the lower 48 states and they say salmon on the restaurant, we always say, is it fresh or is it farm? And they go, oh, it's Atlantic salmon, which of course translates into farmed salmon. That's what Atlantic salmon means. It's farmed salmon. Fresh salmon is Alaska salmon or Seattle or Oregon or Pacific, but not Atlanta salmon. So yeah, you know, now they have a GMO salmon. And it gets big and quickly, and it grows in a tank, and if it ever gets out, they say, you know, just a few of them getting out into the wild, and we're finished. All salmon will be GMO. Wow, hard to believe. It's hard to believe that somebody would screw around with that. You know, we don't like pike in Alaska. It's a very bony fish, and they're not native to Alaska. But there are some people who like pike, and so they like to fish for pike. It's like pulling up a dead boot. And so they stuff pike into various lakes all over Alaska. Oh, God, can you imagine what happens if it says, you know, I like that bigger salmon. Fights more on a hook or something, and then they let them loose. It's going to happen. It has to happen. It always happens. So, big mistake. Yeah, it's different. When you eat a fresh fish, you're eating a fish, whether it has mercury in it or not, I can't tell you. Fish, a lot of the salmon are at the top of the food chain. They say, you know, like swordfish and things, you got to be careful how much of it you eat, if you're pregnant, et cetera, et cetera. But if you've got a choice between fresh and farm, there's a world of difference in taste, in look. They artificially color the farm salmon. That artificial coloring is not a natural color by any means. Yeah, there's a big, big difference, and I'm sure, again, from Sitka, you could probably give us 10 or 15 more, because in Sitka, you can reach in the water and just pull the salmon out with your hand.
Just a little bit more. My understanding that the feed that they give to the farmed salmon is, a lot of it is fish. And so that brings oil into the operation. You have to spend all that oil to go get all that fish, and you're giving them a diet that's not exactly naturally what they would be eating. And so we heard earlier about the oceans drying up and being dead in 50 years or something. The farmed fish industry is part of that, because it's raping the ocean to turn a natural wild animal into another CAFO, another concentrated animal feeding operation. You can't see this CAFO, and it doesn't look as horrendous as pigs or cows stacked on top of each other, because we don't have quite the level of affinity to fish as we do to mammals, but it's just as egregious, it's just as cruel, it's just as inhumane, and underneath those farms, it's a big poop dump, and it kills everything underneath it, and the fish get parasites, so it's a mess, just like the other CAFOs are.
And it doesn't taste as good.
When I spent several years taking a deep dive into this subject, there's not any reason at any time in history that humans should consume fish, that within 20 minutes after you take a fish out of either a lake, a river, an ocean, the fats in it, both good as well as saturated, become rancid, and that's called a lipid peroxide. Write it down. Lipid peroxides, we've known for 6 decades, cause cancer. So all fish are carcinogenic non-foods. Let's start with that. So that's 1,000 years ago, 2,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago, or today. The stunning thing is what you just said. Absurdity is sort of normality today. Why would they create a monstrous Frankenfish is the name they've given it. They've approved it. They call it Frankenfish and they approve it. And most of you think these factory farms are in some wonderful, faraway place long from the ocean. Most factory farms are in the ocean, in bays, in cages where fish can jump out the top. You ever notice whenever I've looked at a salmon, they're jumping. And they put them in cages in the middle of bays in oceans, in places like Maine, you know, all the places you think, like Alaska. There's no laws that govern that they can lie to you. So when you go to a fish restaurant, which to me is a death shop, you basically are not being told, because if you look at the menu, they have an Alaskan Eskimo catching the salmon as it jumps out with its bare hands, you know. And they didn't tell you this comes from China. Now, they put hundreds, this is not an exaggeration or an embellishment, hundreds of times more fish into an enclosure than they would be in nature. Then they have to pour antibiotics in. With salmon, most salmon you're eating today, if you choose to still do that, basically is so anemic, so sick, because they can't get oxygen. They are, through their gills, taking each other's fecal matter in. They're pumping in antibiotics and steroids to these things. They have to actually paint the fish pink, because in your imagination, salmon have to be pink before you chop down on them. So is there any good reason to eat it? There's never a good reason to do anything that you don't need to do. I mean, how I finally got my head together, I said, do I need to do this? Is it something that's essential? Essential means you must do it or you're going to die. There's some problem. And the answer is no. I can tell you 1,000 reasons not to do it. We start with your health. We start with the degradation of the planet. And I'll once again repeat what I said in one of my classes today. Every single legitimate oceanographic scientist and marine biologist says the oceans are going to be fished out by the middle of this century. 30 to 35, 40 years from now, we'll no longer have schools of fish that are out there. So this is not something to tiptoe around. This is something to crush right now and stop participating in it and stop putting economy behind something that kills you, kills the planet, and is as cruel as can be. By the way, in my book, we talk about the study of fish. Now we recognize that fish actually have a higher intelligence than most other creatures, possibly humans. That they actually have, when you see fish, when I'm a diver, when you see fish schools move, it's because you would call it a psychic condition, but it's an inherent instinctual condition where they have sonar working together and they move in this extraordinary way together because they have such community there. That fish actually have memories. So when they go from one place to another, they remember. They remember their children. They have affection. These are not things that we think. These are things we now know. And it's a shame that I'm the one telling you this. I'm not an aquatic expert, but I am certainly an expert on what fish does to your health, and I'm certainly an expert on what fish does to the environment. And if you want to learn more, I'm not trying to sell you a book. You ought to read my book, Killer Fish. And if you eat fish after that, you're a killer. And there's no question about it. You're a person who's suicidal, and there's no question about it. And fish is not a better choice than other meats. This is a meat. It's an aquatic meat. Maybe it doesn't look as much like you. Maybe a cow looks more like you. Certainly today that's true, than a fish. But the reality is, get over it.
I never know what Brian's trying to say. He's always so ambiguous.
So in discussing how fish is different than it was 100 years ago, the next question would be, how is beef different than 100 years ago? And I'd like to read you something. This is an article from Walking Times by Natasha Longo from August 2014. And it just says, did you know, and maybe you could comment on this, did you know these 10 chemical additives are commonly found in meat? Number 1, sodium benzoate, sodium propionate, and benzoic acid. Number 2, asthma-like drugs. It says there is another way factory farms make animals grow faster besides antibiotics and hormones. The asthma-like drug ractopamine is used in 45% of U.S. pigs, according to Bacon Bits, the Canadian pork industry newsletter. It's also used in 30% of ration-fed cattle and a growing number of turkeys. Number 3, nitrates. Nitrates and nitrates are also added to meat products during processing to inhibit the growth of bacteria and enhance color. Number 4, antibiotics. Most people know that antibiotics are part of the diet of U.S. livestock to make them grow faster and prevent disease, but they'd be surprised as how many animals destined for the dinner tables have drug residues that exceed legal limits. Number 5, sulfites. They are used widely as a preservative in food to maintain food color and prolong shelf life. Number 6, carbon monoxide. Most meat eaters may be unaware that more than 70% of all beef and chicken in the United States, Canada, and other countries is being treated with poisonous carbon monoxide gas. It can make seriously decayed meat look fresh for months. Carbon monoxide is a colorless, odorless, and tasteless gas, one measly oxygen molecule away from the carbon dioxide we all exhale, but the one molecule makes a big difference in that it does very, very bad things to the human body at very, very low concentrations. Next one, number 7, heavy metals. The charge that heavy metals lurk in U.S. meat doesn't come from food activists and consumer advocates. It comes from the USDA Office of the Inspector General. In 2010 report found high residues of copper, arsenic, and other heavy metals and veterinary drugs in beef released for public consumption. Number 8, viral sprays. The FDA also approved a viral cocktail spray that might prevent listeriosis. Number 9, meat glue, produced as Activa by Japan's Ajinomoto Company. Its scientific name is transglutaminase, and it belongs to a family of clotting enzymes which are 8 in number. Meat glue is thrombin, a coagulation protein which together with the fibrous protein fibrin can be used to develop a meat glue enzyme that can be used for sticking together different pieces of meat. It can be made from blood taken from either cows or pigs. Number 10, antibiotic-resistant bacteria. You think with the antibiotic party going on, meat would be free of bacteria. You'd be wrong. Bacteria are rife in conventionally grown U.S. meat, including antibiotic-resistant bacteria, also known as superbugs. Almost half of beef, chicken, pork, and turkey in samples tested from U.S. grocery stores contain staph bacteria. So this is just an article that I'm reading, and I don't really know anything about the beef industry, but I would imagine this is different than the past. Do you want to comment on on the way the meat is raised today as maybe it would have been 100 years ago?
Well, I haven't had meat since 1970. I think anybody that's eating meat now from a fast food place or a regular restaurant is nuts. I mean, that's the least of the problems. It can cause disease. What's that disease? They feed cows.
Mad cows.
Mad cow disease. You know, they don't let them chop up cows and give it to cows, but they let them eat their guts and their blood. I mean, that goes into your body, and, you know, in a few decades, you lose completely control of your body, and it's horrible. I mean, anybody that's eating, just going into some place and eating beef today, meat today, is nuts. But the beef industry is afraid because so many people are stopping eating beef. So there's been a real push towards, you know, grass-fed beef is fine. It's grass-fed is fine. Cows will save the planet. Somebody wrote this book, gave it to me. Cows will save the planet. There are too many cows on this planet. There's just way too many cows.
The cows will take over the planet.
The cows will take over the planet, and they give off methane. And the people the proponents of this. Of ranching now, you know, they say, oh, only cows in CAFOs give off methane. Other cows don't give off methane. So I asked Professor at Berkeley that, and he said, no, they give off methane. That's what they do. It doesn't matter what they're eating.
So do we.
And yeah, so I think it's you know, the meat industry, there's a lot of propaganda going on now that we really like our grass-fed and our rancher beef, and I just think we have to be very, very careful. I don't think, whatever it was 100 years ago and people had to eat, you know, meat to survive or whatever they thought, we saw in the talk today. You know, this idea that humans, this paleo diet, that we're just supposed to be eating, you know, meat, it's actually not even true. They've done the studies, not even true. That isn't what the paleo people ate. They ate mostly vegetables. So I think, you know, it's just a hugely propagandistic topic. But what you just read, anybody listening to this, I mean, why would anybody go out and eat meat now after you read that? I don't even haven't had meat in decades, and I'm already repulsed. I'm repulsed all over again by it. It's horrible.
There's some marketing accomplishments that are just stunning when you look at it. I mean, the other night we had a panel here you may have seen where, you know, the docs were very liberal and very open-minded, and then we got to the subject. They said the pharmaceuticals are bad, it's horrible, and we said, well, how about vaccines? Oh, that's pristine and it's perfect, and nobody. So everyone has sort of a ceiling, and people will fight about vaccines, although they should be suspicious. They'll fight about meat because their mother told. You know, I finally realized this about 35 years ago. The biggest problem is not the addiction and the pattern of eating, but it's the mommy factor. My mother, who loved me, gave me meat and told me it was good for me. That's an emotional tie, man, that's intense. That's an emotional tie that's intense. And so you have these, so that's why they'll do it. You know, they'll march to their death because, Mom, you don't want to cut that tie with your mother. So there's an emotional relationship with it. I'll never forget the first Thanksgiving when I was a vegan. You know, I said to my vegan girlfriend at that point, hey, come on, just, you know, Thanksgiving I need turkey, because here in the United States we eat turkey on Thanksgiving. She said, no, we're not going to get turkey. And she made me a Brazil nut loaf that was in the shape of a turkey with the stuffing in it. Now, I didn't really want the turkey. I wanted the taste of Thanksgiving. You want the taste of Christmas, the taste of Hanukkah, the taste of a holiday, the taste of your birthday. You don't have to contaminate yourself and kill creatures and kill the planet in the process. Give yourself the seasoning. That's all you want. Be a little respectful. You're not as dumb as you think you are.
They just passed the law that they don't have to put the country of origin now on meat.
That's right.
Well,
it's probably from Brazil, where they're destroying the rainforest. And, you know, most of you that are eating fast food don't realize, you know, you're marching in the street against knocking down the rainforest on the way to the hamburger joint. All the Priuses in the world and the electric cars like I own in the world are not going to save the planet. It's going to be stopping eating animals, drinking milk out of their bosom, and shipping it around the planet. As you know, over half the greenhouse gases come from meat and dairy consumption.
Compared to 100 years, what is different about the soil? I've heard that the mineralization is different, and therefore when you grow a plant today versus 100 years ago, there are certain minerals that you would have gotten, then eaten, and they would have helped your body. But now, if those minerals have been stripped and there's none of that mineral, then the food, even if it grows, you're not getting the same minerals in your food that you would have. Could you explain that?
I guess I can explain it because I made a film on soil. Yeah, in nature, when a leaf falls, it's called Sir Albert Howard's law of return. When a leaf falls to the ground under a tree, the microorganisms decompose it, and those nutrients break down and are taken up by the tree and to create new leaves and other plants around it. And so what we've done is in agriculture, you take that what falls from the tree or was grown from the plant, you take it out of the field and you don't give back to the soil. So what we've done in our agriculture, industrial agriculture, is we've been taking from the soil and not giving back. So the soil is depleted of minerals and all the things the microorganisms need to create a healthy system in the soil. So yeah, we have done that, and so food does have fewer minerals in it than it does, unless it's grown in good organic farms that actually focus on on doing the right thing and doing crop rotation and doing cover crops and putting compost back in and all these kinds of things that you feed the soil. People are supposed to, you're supposed to grow soil, and the soil grows plants. And we've depleted the soil, and we've depleted of the nutrients, and so, I think that's one of the reasons why people have a lot of health problems is they just don't have that vitality and strength that comes from eating food from soil that's really healthy.
Microbiome.
Yeah, the microbiome. Because even today, he was showing in the film, we've taken the soil, we've actually taken the soil, what the soil has this process of transformation where you transform something, break it down, and make the nutrients available. Our gut functions as that. We've taken the soil into our body. That's where we break down our nutrients and make them available to our body to grow. And so if our gut is deformed because we've been eating the wrong things, then we can't do that. We can't break it down. We don't have access to those nutrients. And so we've sort of have this big problem, the same problem that the soil has, we have in our bodies. But, there's a lot of really good organic farms out there, and there's a lot of, people are more and more aware of this, and you can find good food, and you can heal yourself. So I think that's true. And the soil, in 2015 was the UN Year of the Soils. There was a huge focus on soil all over the world. And I was fortunate that my film was official part of that year. So all over the world now, there's this rising soil consciousness. So it's, people are getting more and more excited about the soil because of science. We know more what's going on, so we can measure what's going on in the soil. We can see it because of electron microscopes and because of computers and even satellites where you look at it from space and can see what's happening. So it's an exciting field now, and there's actually a lot of young people interested in that field. And I actually think, of course, industrial agriculture damages the soil, degrades the soil, erodes the soil, all those kinds of things. But there's a huge alternative movement, and even in conventional agriculture, people are getting more interested in cover crops and trying to do crop rotation. So I think I think we bottomed out in terms of that considered to be acceptable, and we're starting slowly to build back up. But we have to replenish the soils that we've been mining instead of farming. There's the theory of mining, because California is mining and agriculture. Mining is gut it and get out. Gut it and get out. Just take it and go. And agriculture, you need to stay there and cultivate, sustain it. And so there are these two different ways of doing it, and I think people are returning to this idea of cultivating the soil and having a relationship with it that can be sustained for decades, which means you have to give back to it. And also, just one thing, I think the way that we degraded our soils, which take and take and take and don't give back, I think that that's affected us as a society, especially in the United States, where it became acceptable to take and take and take and not give back to society.
Oh, yes.
And I think we've kind of reached the end of that, and people are looking around and thinking, what kind of society do we want to live in? That we're just all taking and getting away with whatever we can, because things will collapse. The same way the soil will collapse, our society will collapse. And I think there's a fear now that we've headed too far in that direction, and I hope that, we'll be able to, rise back up from that and create a healthier whole environment in every way. Yeah.
Again, hard to add too much to that, but there are a lot of things that are going on the chemical lands, not the organic lands that were described. And so when you use these chemicals, as I explained in my talk, the plant decides that it doesn't need to do a lot of the things that it naturally would do. One of the things it doesn't do is associate with mycorrhizal fungi, and if it doesn't associate with the mycorrhizal fungi, then it's not getting all of the, it's just everything gets screwed up into a different system. So you get a plant that tastes like something, but it doesn't taste like it might have originally tasted. And you might not even know what it originally tasted like. When you give somebody a celery that's grown in an organic garden, picked right out of the organic garden, versus a piece of celery that comes from a supermarket, their teeth fall out. They're so shocked. They can't understand what they've been eating. It's like mushrooms. People eat mushrooms. Just as an aside, you can't digest mushrooms unless they're cooked. So think of how many mushrooms you've had in salads over the years that you've never digested, but you don't know that, so you continue to eat them. And it's the same thing with a lot of these foods. We eat them, we don't know that they don't taste the way they're supposed to taste because they're not grown in a natural situation. The nitrogen in them is not natural nitrogen. It's not fixed nitrogen. It's Haber-Bosch nitrogen. Half the nitrogen in your body is no longer natural nitrogen. You are half artificial nitrogen, or more even. You know, it's sort of amazing when you think about that. The fact that our soils are being inundated in areas that are heavy with dairy with so much of pollutants, phosphorus and potash, you know, to the point where, you know, if you use too much phosphorus, you can never get the mycorrhizal fungi. In places in Anchorage, Alaska, because we had a guy who used to write a newspaper column that said used 83216. 32 is the middle number. That's phosphorus. That's incredibly high. It's so high that it'll take another 100 years for people whose property have had that on it to be able to support mycorrhizal fungi because there's so much phosphorus left over there in that soil. But in many places, this stuff just goes right into the water system and washes out because we've lost soil structure. We're losing soil like crazy. It's blowing away like no one's business. And so we bring us back to GMO. One of the things that the Monsanto folks are doing now is they're saying GMO is good because with GMO, you don't need to rototill anymore. You can just put this stuff down and you can spray to your heart's content. You don't need to lose soil. Well, that soil ends up with DNA from GMO. And that DNA is transferable. Bacteria transfer DNA. They just do it. That's what they do. That's how they survive. And it's happening in the soil. Now, you can believe, you know, people like Dr. Huber, who theorize that they're actually brand new species no one's ever seen before as a result of this, which makes sense when you think about the fact that it's DNA, you know, or not. You got to think there's something weird going on if you're being told that there's a capability. Forget whether it's actually happening or not. You're just being told there's a capability that you've got bacteria in your gut producing BT because they adopted this stuff. Well, what's happening in the soil? Our gut is the soil. You know, the analogy is a clean one. So there's all these things that are going on, and then of course if you're not getting those mycorrhizal fungi in your soil, so that's the difference from 100 years ago. That mycorrhizal fungi, the arboristical ones, they're the ones that put the carbon in the soil. So 100 years ago, you were getting a lot of carbon put in the soil, where today you're not getting carbon put in the soil. Well, if you're not getting carbon put in the soil, then you're not supporting the life in the soil. You're not having soil structure as a result of not having life, and you start losing more soil. You lose water, on and on and on and on and on. So yeah, there's a big difference between conventional soil today and what that soil was 100 years ago. A gigantic difference. And anybody who works in that soil will tell you that. I'm convinced they know it. It's just that farmers need to live. And they think that if they make a change back to the old system, they might not be able to survive. You know, so we've got to convince them we have to do that. And we have to convince the public, and you know, that's what these kinds of things do. And there's one other thing that happens. You know, what we're beginning to see around the country, in St. Louis, I have a friend named James Sotilo. He owns a company called TreeWise. James is the guy that comes into the World Trade Center after it comes down and sprays it with compost tea. The whole area was sprayed with compost tea, I might add, for soil from Alaska to put the microbiology back in after the Trade Center went down. James comes in, and he's the landscaper now for the World Trade Center. And he puts the high line. He does the high line. He's doing the St. Louis Arch. And the soil is so bad there that he's had to do all of these, very organic, he's had to do all this composting and everything. And he planted daikon radishes, thousands of daikon radishes throughout the Arch area in St. Louis. And it was written up in the paper, in the New York. Everybody thought he was nuts. But when he explained what he was doing, and 6 months later when people saw the results, now vineyards, projects all around the country are doing exactly the same thing. And so we're getting these kinds of changes that happen because of some great visibility. The movie, for example. Anytime anybody sees that movie, they understand. So these kinds of things just have to continue, and soil's changing, and the best way to change the soil is to bring it back to the way it used to be.
Exactly.
And that's what we're doing.
So what were the daikon radishes doing, pulling up the toxins?
What the daikon radishes do is they break up the compacted soil. And they're very heavy mycorrhizal, so they put out, and so they really just decompact that soil, bring in drainage. You know, you think about millions of people have been walking around that arch soil, compact. Unbelievable stuff that he does. And if you ever see a project done by TreeWise, James Sotilo, you want to walk around, you want to see if you can get anything written about it because it's all organic. You know, it's beautiful, spectacular stuff, returning the soil back to the way it was before all these chemicals came in. Because things were great back then, everything worked. Yeah.
A couple of thoughts on this. The entire future of medicine is going to be that they'll finally conclude what the Chinese taught us 2,000 years ago, that we're electromagnetic frequencies that reside in the physical body. So the electromagnetic frequency actually comes from the sun. And the energy that governs the multiple universes called zero-point gravity. And every one of your cells, you have about 100 trillion cells, vibrate at 75 megahertz. Now that's the healthiest people now. I think none of us on this planet are doing that. We know that when people have cancer, you're about 10 hertz. So let's not address the electromagnetic part of your body. Let's address the physical part, and that's what you've just discussed. You are made of soil. What keeps you in a physical form are the nutrients and the bacteria from soil. This is not theological. What we're talking about now is state-of-the-art science. And we've been in a period, everyone sitting here, we're old enough, we came from a period from the time we were children of the chemical age. We're going back to the biological age now. So the people who are even conservative researchers and medical people today understand that the chemical age has failed. So we're being forced to now look at putting bacteria back in the body, at some level doing farming like this, and you're right, young people are interested. People coming from upper middle class and middle class families want to go and become farmers. One of the guys that work with me told me the other day that his son wants to be a farmer. Grew up in New England, you know, a very conventional family, but he wants to be a farmer. So that's one aspect. Number two, watch the film this wonderful Miss Garcia made, and another film that was just stunning to me. Yeah, give her a hand for that. I happen to, a good friend of mine always calls me up and says, did you see this? Do you see it? And 99% of the time I haven't seen it. And he said, I'm going to send this to you. And Discovery, and you're going to help me on this, Discovery went into forest, and God knows how many years or decades they spent there, and looked at trees and looked at the forest. And when I saw this, I cried. I actually cried. It was so touching. Did anyone have an opportunity out there to see this? You have to find this. It's a Discovery show that literally was on trees and forest and how they communicate with one another. And the Mother Tree. Susan Samart, Mother Tree. This is a must-see. The two films, if you look at these two films, this panel's great. These two films will really get you to what we're trying to do tonight.
You know, when you say bacteria, soil bacteria, I mean, you weren't kidding. We have more bacteria cells in our body than we have human cells in our body.
2/3 of our body, what we're physically looking at here, 2/3 is bacteria.
And so when you talk about DNA being transferred, which happens all the time, and talk about BT being transferred, which happens all the time, whew, pretty fascinating stuff. What we haven't talked about is the other form of GMO, which is coming under the line, and you know, I don't know whether anybody's got a firm opinion on it yet, which is the CRISPR type. You know, instead of putting a cat gene into a plant, you know, what they're taking is a little bit of a gene from a bacteria and changing the gene in the bacteria, or you know, they're cutting little pieces out and repasting stuff. It's GMO. What's that going to do to our food system? I have no idea.
You didn't have enough to worry about.
Yeah, we have enough to worry about, but it's coming for sure. And it may actually be that the GMO that we know about now, which appears, you know, to us at least, to be evil, is evil, and this other one might be good. But because of this first GMO and the way Monsanto and anybody handled the PR and everything else, it might ruin the other GMO. Who knows? I mean, it's, you know, that CRISPR, they keep talking about medical applications as opposed to food applications. Seems to me there's a slightly different thing, but I could be wrong. I don't know enough about it.
Well, when you look at the pictures they set out of the CRISPR, basically, a woman figured out how to basically just remove one gene. And the picture of it, there's just like scissors that cut it in and just take it out, remove it. And I think that I heard her speak on the radio. She's from she's in the Bay Area. The problem is that they don't know, she even admitted during the interview, they don't really know what the repercussions are going to be of changing that particular genome. They don't know, because it's not like one gene. They think that if you have there are very few medical situations where you can actually remove one gene and that will solve the problem that that person has. I mean, even cancer, you know, most cancers are environmentally caused. They're not caused by genetics. But so the problem with DNA, the whole thing of doing something very simple and perceiving DNA as being a machine, the genome is a machine, and we just take out one part and the machine will still work, is it's not a gene, it's an organism. And it's very mysterious. We don't really understand how DNA works. We don't really understand what makes a gene. You know, we can name it. You know, we can say this is what your chromosomes look like, but we don't know what will happen if we take one thing out, because it's not like one gene always creates one trait. It does what it expresses the proteins it expresses because of the environment at that particular time, what's going on around it. We don't know. It's mysterious. Just because we can make a list of the things that are in a certain genome doesn't mean that we know how that genome works. So getting in there and messing around with it and letting it out into the environment is terrible. I think doing medical is that is very promising. That could work. Maybe it won't work. We don't know if it'll work or not work. But I do think they all have to be contained in experiments and not let out, because there is this horizontal gene transfer. DNA is promiscuous. Bacteria are promiscuous. Their genes are jumping all over the place, and they do things people didn't know they would ever do. And so now the best geneticists know what they don't know. They know what they don't know. And as I said in my talk, there's this whole part of DNA that they used to call junk DNA because they didn't know what it did. So I figure it's junk. And now they think it's the brains behind it all. So they don't call it junk anymore. They call it non-genomic DNA. So it's very mysterious, and we just need to be careful about accepting these things. Just because we can do it doesn't mean we know the consequences of it or that we should do it.
So just to wrap up this point, based on all the changes in the soil in the last 100 years, for those of us that are not scientific, we buy broccoli, we're eating broccoli, we're buying some nuts. What minerals am I not getting today that I would have got 100 years ago that I need for health? What's not in the soil that used to be in the soil that I am now not getting and that I need to figure out how to get?
You know, I don't know the exact numbers, but I know you can go to Arden Anderson's site, Dr. Mercola's site, and look these things up. There's no question that the Brix levels are lower in many of these foods. They have fewer vitamins and nutritional values in many of these foods. You know, there are always these studies that say, is organic better than non-organic? You know, but that's not really what you're talking about here. You're talking about these are foods that are grown in bad soil. Simple as that. And there are all sorts of demonstrations. If you take I'm trying to remember what the statistic was, a salad in 1941 versus a salad today has half the nutritional level of it, you know, with tomatoes and lettuce and cucumber and all that kind of stuff you put in it. It's somewhere in that area.
The most notable deficiencies for a long time now have been selenium, which we recognize in the late part of the 20th century was crucial for the immune function. Iodine, which has never been in the soil when food is grown inland and now is lacking even in coastal regions. Manganese has a lot to do with the heart, the frequencies we just spoke about in cells. Magnesium, calcium. Stanford just published a study a couple of years ago, and my colleagues in the natural health field were angry because I agreed with them. They showed that the commercial organic food was no more nutritious than commercial food. Now, certainly you'd buy the organic food, but these hundreds and hundreds or millions of acres of organic growing that's going on in states like California, they don't take care of the soil. So the little farmer up the street from your house that's been a farmer since 1965, that's where you go to get the food. Because if it doesn't have minerals from composting and from rotation and companion planting and all of that, you're in trouble.
But I think that Stanford study, they actually didn't do the study themselves. I think they looked at studies that had been done.
Mega study.
And I think that some of those studies had been, or were quite old that they took from. So I think they need to do a current study. There are bad organic farms, but I think there are a lot of really good organic farms. And so I think that, you know, the secret is to find one that you like and, you know, and support that, because you know that they do take care of their soil.
But you know, it's unique in a state like California, and we get very
Yeah.
colloquial.
Yeah.
Florida, for instance, should have the most organic farms in the country, and we have very few organic farms here. They always make the excuse that literally the soil is too bad. Well, we have an organic farm on Hippocrates' property, and every week it gets better than the week before. But the truth of the matter is that it's not as easy in most parts of the world to walk out the door and find a small 5-acre, 10-acre, several hectare farm. And, you know, that's one of the reasons I love going to the state of California.
Brian, you know, you're a guy that's kind of interesting to people because you eat a raw food diet with almost no fruit. So you're really testing green drinks, wheatgrass, sunflower sprouts. You're really testing the benefits of lifestyle. So I'd like to ask you how old you are, if your hair is real, if you dye your hair, and if you're wearing contacts.
Well, I'm actually like him, and this is a wig. Not real. This is my hair, and yes, part of it happens to be that I've been eating this way, but part of it, let's be honest, is genetics. My granddad died in his late 80s with a full head of dark hair. So, yeah, my two brothers, who obviously do not eat like me, went bald and got gray, and the one went bald, was getting gray or getting bald before he died of a fatty liver by eating fast foods. And so it's part of it. I don't need to dye my hair, thank God, and now moving into my late 60s. And I just am happy to be alive. That's all I can say.
What about contacts? Do you wear contacts?
No contacts. I don't wear glasses at all.
Boxers or briefs?
Organic, both. Both. Depends upon the mood I'm in, or the mood my wife is in, I should say. And let me say something to you. I mean, you know, we've all struggled to start eating more plant-based food, and then we struggle to eat organic plant-based food. The new paradigm shift, and it will happen, is going to be to get to a place where we don't cook and destroy the nutrition in the food. I mean, how bizarre it is that we haven't even addressed that issue at this point. Somehow you think there's magic. You can kill other things and they die, but you kill food and they don't die. And you know, so we've got to address this at some point. And until we address that, we won't get to the emotional, physical, and spiritual state that we need to be.
So assuming that there was someone in our audience who was a phenomenal leader, unbelievably passionate, has huge Facebook followings, lots of money, and they're going to change the world, and they just need to know what to do. So if you wanted to fix the food system, and you were in charge, you had full access and resources, and you were the person to make the decision, and there was someone out there that was going to make it happen, what are your 5 best suggestions? If you're now president of the world, everyone's going to listen to whatever you say. What are the 5 things that we should all be screaming for, yelling for, petitioning for, demanding? What are the very 5 best suggestions? You're in charge of the world.
We don't want to be president of the world, we want to be emperor of the world.
Okay.
You start off, emperor.
5 is way more than I could come up with, but I will come up with a good one, and if more come, I'll speak to that. But I think at least as far as GMOs go, the problem is that we allow them to be patented, and if we were to stop the patenting, then they would no longer be able to control it and say that they own it, and that they can sue other people when it's contaminated. And so I see the revocation of patenting could go a long ways to returning seeds to the farmers, and essentially through GMO technology and the patenting of that technology, and the technology itself, I might add, is we can call that stolen material, because often they've taken the genetics that have been the result of 10,000 years of cultivation, and they've taken something out of that and put it into something else, and then claim that it's theirs. And really, we're talking about stealing the work and talent and skills of millennia of farmers, and then saying we own this. It's another way of rich people taking what the indigenous people of the world have done free and freely, and then claimed it for their own, and then turned around and said it's illegal now for you to even save seed. So it's a tremendous, it's a perverse thing to do. It's a violation. It's a violent form of agriculture. So if we could get rid of the patenting and give back seed to the farmers so that they could grow their food, save their seeds, pass it around the way it's been done forever, that would do a lot to take the power out of their hands.
If we had a limitless budget, and I assume that's what you've just said, and you've made us emperors of the world, the first thing I would do is make sure that everyone went to and became familiar with every other culture. The neighborhoods that you would never go to, the countries that you never thought of visiting. And to be educated that we all are one, that we're all sharing this planet. That would be the number one most important thing we could do to change the course of humanity at this point. Now, the secondary, and then we'll go on to the other four, would be that we have to have nutritious, sustainable food that everyone's getting. And I'll repeat what I just said 6.5 minutes ago, that it's incredibly important for you to understand that food doesn't only have to do with substance for the body, but it has to do with your emotional state and the spiritual state, your own as well as your connectivity to the exterior spirit, the library, the invisible library. This is why every religion in the world's history, every great teacher has addressed diet and food. The third thing that we should do is we should take the economy of the world and begin to shift it to healing. We call it today pretentiously the green economy. I'd like to change that. They've already prostituted that. And so what we need to do is to talk about the recovery economy. Bring back and recover the oceans. Bring back and recover the soil. Bring back and recover the rainforest. And recover the degradation that we have caused because of our greed, our unconsciousness, and our overconsumption. It's not a big step from slaughtering and eating animals and slaughtering people. I don't think that there's any doubt in my mind why they're able to achieve war and get people to kill one another for absolutely no reason. Is because we've been doing that from the time we were children by slaughtering animals and eating them and drinking milk out of them. And so this is all a big, big circle. Next, what we should do is that we should look at what I call the realistic aesthetics of the planet Earth and recognize that we don't have to fabricate or create beauty, that everything is unbelievably beautiful. When I get up early in the morning, I say, thank you, look at this, it's like amazing. When the sun goes down at night, I say, wow, that's like unbelievable. And teach our children, get with our children, and say, look at this as our gift. Shut the televisions off. Get rid of the smartphones. They're not so smart, by the way. Look at the studies that they reduce IQs. Shut the computers off and start to communicate. As an employer of far more than 100 people, I can tell you, when I hire people below 40, they have no communication skill. None. They don't know how to communicate anymore. And we need to get people to be respectful, and start to honor and respect the aesthetics of what we already have. And lastly, we should start to recognize that the most powerful people in the history of humanity were people who loved, not people who hated, you know. When I think of somebody I want to be like when I grow up, it's Mahatma Gandhi. It's Martin Luther King. It's Mandela. It's Mother Teresa, who they just canonized. That's who I want to be like when I grow up. And if we just achieve those 5 things, you would see a radical shift back to normality within 1 generation. This is not a fantasy. This is something I've thought about a lot before you've asked this question. This is something I've created a world called Hippocrates Health Institute that we do at Hippocrates Health Institute. And we have the results that we see what happens when we create an ecosystem of sanity. And this is achievable. But you've got to take the first step to become 100% utterly responsible for every thought, every action that you ever pursue in your entire life. No more diverting to somebody else.
I would be a lot more pragmatic. I would outlaw the tens of thousands of agricultural chemicals and poisons that we've been using and get rid of those completely. I don't know where they would go. And I would outlaw their manufacture. I would outlaw GMOs and take whatever GMO seeds still exist and, I don't know, burn them in the Arctic or bury them or something horrible like that.
Send them to Alaska.
Wait, I don't know, the Antarctic. Anyway, I would get rid of those. I would mandate that all food had to be grown organically. I would increase the number of, diminish the number. I would actually get rid of all the soy and corn that's grown in the middle of this country and turn that over to vegetables. And I don't eat meat, but I think, and I would actually, I would create a fund that gives farmers funding to buy land with no interest and allow them to do that. I would mandate that in schools children had to learn gardening as well as cooking, both the girls and the boys. And I would mandate that people in schools would have to go into nature and explore nature and walk around and see what it's like so that they connect up with the natural world. And then I think that I would basically put a very high tax on white sugar. And I would
drug white sugar.
White sugar and white flour, and I would you know, some of those things you can't take away completely, but I would make that of like a very, you know, I don't know, I would make that like something people that would be highly illegal, you know, like a terrible drug that they'd have to secretly, you know, try to find. And I would basically try to reprogram society to eat very, very healthy meals, subsidize them. I think it would be great in communities to have, because not everybody wants to cook a full meal every day, but I would set up centers where people could come and have, you know, like in Europe they have cafes, and in London, in England, they have pubs, and communities go there and they meet and they see the same people every day and they can have their meals. And I would institute things like that in communities where, you know, if you live alone or you have a small family, you could go to these places. There's a place in Austin like that. They serve one meal, it's organic, you go there, it's inexpensive, you get the meal, you go through with a tray and you get it, and it's really, really good food, and you see great people there, and you sit at community tables. And I would institute these things so that people who are living alone or old people, that they don't have to just have a, you know, microwave TV dinner and be all by themselves. So it can be part of this community, and there can also be a garden attached to it. There can be cooking classes for it. Would find subsidized low-income people to be able to buy healthy food, and just basically put all the resources that we're putting into basically destroying countries into rebuilding our country and our country's health. And actually, we could do that right now. But I think that's a possible thing to do, and I think it's what people want, and it would make people so much happier that we wouldn't need a lot of these antidepressants and, you know, things like that people need, because I think they're eating badly and that they're not feeding themselves emotionally and psychologically. And I think that if you start with food and you can build from there, we could actually create a happier society, and people would be more creative, and I think it would be lovely.
I'm with you. I'll go there.
Well, let's see, what would I do? I would immediately call an halt to the United States election. I would make Donald Trump's lips never move again. I would make Hillary Clinton's nose grow whenever she told a lie. And I would appoint Bernie Sanders as President of the United States. That's the first thing I would do. The second thing I would do is I would make sure that every child was educated, and that every adult got to have a couple of grandchildren.
Yeah.
Because first of all, grandchildren are the finest things in the world to ever associate yourself with.
I'm with you.
Yeah. And second of all, if you have grandkids, then you have a vested future. And when you have grandkids, it is a love like no other love you ever had, including your own children, probably. Yeah. Certainly, and it is a opportunity to recast and retone your thinking, so that they can succeed, better than you, which is important. I would put term limits on all elections all around the world. I would make sure that everybody passed a test on the scientific method, and let's see, and I would figure out a way.
You mean on procreation? Or?
I would figure out a way so that I could eat my two favorite foods, popcorn and pizza.
Just to clarify right now, where are we getting GMOs that we might not realize it? If I go to the supermarket right now today, where exactly could I be? If I want to avoid GMOs, what do I have to avoid at the supermarket?
You should take that one.
Avoid corn syrup, high fructose corn syrup.
Is that GMO?
Yes.
All the time?
Oh, yes.
So every product made with high
I'm going to say
fructose corn
yes.
syrup?
Virtually.
Yes.
And that's just about
And if it's
every-
not, it has a peanut-like allergy because it was made on equipment that was associated, or something like that sort. But yes, high fructose syrup. I stay away from soy, although we did hear the good doctor explain this afternoon that not all soy is GMO, but I would stay away from it because
97% is.
yeah. So I would stay away from it, although that's numbers can be misleading. I mean, it may be that 97% of the soy is used to feed cattle, but I don't know.
Organic soy, is that?
Well, there is
GMO?
organic soy. I mean, obviously, what you want to look for is organic.
But is organic GMO?
Yes,
I'm sorry.
organic is supposed to be. It's supposed to
It's
be
not
Organic
GMO.
GMO.
It's not
Organic-
GMO.
got it.
supposed to be GMO free. So
is.
it is.
It usually is,
if
'cause
you can
there's not
trust the
that kind of
certifiers.
contamination.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
And that's the problem. I mean, can you trust the certifiers? The other thing is, if you buy a USDA organic label, I don't know about people in the other country, that entitles the individual that is selling the product to have up to 5% of the goods in that product non-organic if there is no availability of an organic ingredient and they have to use it. So when you hear them say, oh, it's organic, I look at this, again, I don't want to pick on Safeway, but I will, the Safeway brand. Well, it's organic, USDA organic, but it can have 5% non-organic in it. What does that mean?
But it can't have GMO in it.
It cannot have GMO
Can't
in it.
have
That
GMO
is true.
in it if
Yeah.
it's labeled organic.
Thank you for slapping me and getting me back in. Yeah, it can't have GMO in it.
And sugar beets. So it can say cane sugar. Cane sugar is not GMO, but if it just says sugar, then you think maybe it's sugar beets. Alfalfa. People
Papaya.
sprout alfalfa.
Papaya.
From Hawaii.
Unless it's organic.
There are some organic. There's some squash. It's not widely available, though. And lecithin. Lecithin in non-organic food is usually from soy. And I don't think there's much bovine growth hormone anymore, but organic milk is a really good idea if you drink milk. I think is that it?
No, they have an apple now.
Oh yeah, the apple. Then the Arctic apple that doesn't brown, so it can be really old and it doesn't look old. What a horrible idea.
One time the Garden Writers of America went to Monsanto back in the day, and we actually had never heard of GMO, and we were in there, and they showed us a woman, she had her hands in the little thing, and she was shooting x-rays into cells trying to make GMO products. And they had a couple of things that they were growing GMO. Of course, in the back of this place there were dogs barking and stuff, you know, it was very eerie. But when we walked in, it was a very hot day in St. Louis, and they gave us some ice cream. And my friend and I, because we were in Monsanto, said, I'm not eating that. And he said, I'm not eating it either. So we left it. We left it on the table, and we went up and we took a tour around, and we saw them, you know, while they were practicing their GMO games and everything else. And 3 hours later, we came back downstairs, and there was the Monsanto ice cream. It had not melted. So when you tell me that they eat organic food there, man, I have to shake my head. And
That's what they were feeding you.
yeah, exactly.
They're trying to make you guys dumb so you didn't complain about what they were doing.
Tomatoes have, for at least 2 decades now, been spliced with fish genes.
No, that's not out, though. That's
No,
not
but
available.
that's what they've been doing. That's
Wow.
what they were
It was
doing.
out very briefly.
And pork has had human genes in it for a long time. These are things that go back 20, 25 years. So those of you that think pork's a perfectly fine food, they may sneak in human genes to that.
Yeah, and you may
I don't
not,
think
and you may not know that your
they
vitamin.
can do it, but it's not being sold. It's not available to the public.
Not that we're aware of.
Yeah, maybe they're making vitamin D, however, because they use pig skin a lot of times to make vitamin D.
Exactly.
And who knows, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So, yeah, it's troublesome that they can do it or know how to do it.
Is corn if the corn is not organic, can it be GMO?
Most corn that's not organic is GMO, and it used to be that sweet corn and popcorn weren't GMO, but now they do have those GMO. So you have to be very, very careful, especially because pollen, unlike soybeans, corn has pollen that can contaminate the field next to it. So I think people that grow organic corn are very serious about making sure it's organic. So I think if you're going to eat corn at all, or you have something that has corn syrup in it, there is organic corn syrup, although, you know, it's not, you know, they do have it because people want it in their cereals or whatever. So that's something you really want to make sure is organic, because it's because the pollen can contaminate corn so easily. So that's one you really want to make. I think corn and soy, you just really want to, if you're eating corn and soy, you really have to make sure it's organic, and buy it from farmers or companies that you know are really checking, because that's you know, that almost all the soy that's grown around, almost all the GMO that's grown here and other places in the world are corn and soy, almost all of it.
Now sugar, a lot of things have sugar in it. You're saying it's possible just the word sugar could mean GMO?
Yes.
Sugar beets are GMO, but cane
they
sugar
can
isn't.
actually call sugar beets. In my book, I have 2 pages of different names they use for sugars. So they can get beet from a sugar and call it fructose, because that's what it is.
So any sweetener at this point could be called, could have GMO?
Unless it says cane sugar. See, if you say cane sugar, and they have organic cane sugar, if it's cane sugar, it's not GMO.
Okay.
But sugar beets are GMO. So then, like saying, that you could call it all different kinds of things.
So,
And corn syrup is probably GMO.
so in general, when we think about, you know, something like animal products and cholesterol, the concern is that if you eat animal products for a number of years, it could lead to heart disease. With GMO, is it the same thing, that if we do this for 40 years, it'll be a problem? Or is it something where if we just do it occasionally over the year, that one time it gets in your body and multiplies? Or is this something that it's mostly harmless if you just do it occasionally?
I don't think it's going to damage anything one time, but the studies they've done on animals and rats show all kinds of problems, immune system problems, kidney, liver, endocrine system, reproductive. I mean, it's, you know, there's a whole long list of things that happen when they feed rats with GMO, and also lots of farmers have found problems in animals that are fed with GMO. So it's really something people want to avoid, and I think that they shouldn't be casual about it. I think it should really be almost a religious thing not to eat that stuff. I don't think it's good, and I think it's you know, damaging. There are enough chemicals in our environment that assault our immune systems, that why eat something when you don't have to? Because there's so many things we're exposed to that we can't not be exposed to. So why not go out of our way to really make sure that we're not taking in any more, you know, harmful things than we really have to?
The documents that were exhumed from these companies show that in very rapid order, the genetic modified foods, and I'm not sure which ones, to be candid with you, create perforations in the intestinal tracts of both animals and humans. So irritable bowel syndrome is a direct result in the majority of cases of genetic modified food consumption. If you look at the studies that were done and published in the British Journal of Medicine on obesity in children, Anna will speak about that on Saturday. Here it is directly with high fructose corn syrup, and I don't want to get into an elaborate scientific discussion here, but there is a chain reaction that occurs that literally shuts off the burning of fat inside of the body from consuming genetically modified food. But in candor, we really don't have long-term evidence on this yet. It's a fairly new process. One thing we can say is ookie. It's ookie. It's bad. Don't do it. Why let them experiment on you? And that's exactly what they're doing. Just like the pharmaceutical industry now has no rigid research being done. They do their own research. So they experiment on the public, and as long as the public doesn't react by lawsuits that will paralyze the pharmaceuticals, they continue. And if there's only a few deaths and they're still making good profit, they'll continue it. The same thing is happening now with the food industry. They're studying and testing on human beings. You're the guinea pigs today.
So Vandana Shiva would say, grow organic heirloom seeds and then save the seeds when you're done in India. Now, we live in the United States, so the word seed saving doesn't seem to be a big deal. Is there something we should say about seed saving? Should we be taking this serious? Should we be thinking about it?
Absolutely, and I don't know any garden writer that writes a column that doesn't tell people you should be planting heirloom seeds, that doesn't tell people in their own area why they're planting heirloom seeds, because they can make their own heirlooms for their own area. Now in Pennsylvania they don't have to worry about heirloom seeds; they've got them there. But in places like Alaska or a new community in California, et cetera, I'm teaching people in Anchorage, Alaska, to keep the seeds that are good, of the plants that bloom early, fruit, et cetera, and we're going to have, for the first time ever, heirloom seeds for Alaska. Every area needs their own heirloom seeds. That's what it's all about. You get the diversity, because every area has a slightly different. You get this good gene pool that works in your particular area. Really important. And I see heirloom seed sales going up like crazy. I see heirloom seed availability going up like crazy. More and more catalogs are carrying it, and I think it's quite the fad, and it's a good one. And I hope it continues for a long, long time, because saving those seeds makes sure that Monsanto, Bayer, or whatever they're going to call themselves, can't take over. At some point in time, when you need those fish hooks and a couple of packets of seeds, because there's no communication with anybody, you live in a place like Alaska, if they blow that highway up and there are no planes flying, what are we going to do? We're going to use our heirloom seeds and our fish hooks, unfortunately.
There's an island that Norway owns in between Iceland and Norway, where they have a fortress that some of your fellow Americans funded, that 87% of all the original seeds are locked in. So the most powerful human who's ever lived on the planet wasn't an emperor or a president or a dictator. It's the man who has the key to that. Because we can turn on and turn off the destiny of different cultures and societies globally. They did an experiment, I don't want to get deeply into this, in Africa, where they doubled and tripled the price of grain overnight, and the resulting effect of that has been hundreds of thousands of deaths. In India, it is documented between 200,000 and 300,000 Indian farmers, because they were disgraced when they were not told that Monsanto seeds did not produce seeds, and their families forever through history have been farmers. They committed suicide because they couldn't feed their family. This is not a small issue that's an inconvenience to you, and you may have gas. This is death and life we're talking about.
And Steve, to go back to the the area of your questioning, you know, if you decide you want to go GMO, you know, you listen to Jeff Smith and you feel, okay, I'm convinced, I'm 100% convinced, and then you start looking at the list. It is difficult. Chewing gum. Who would think chewing gum would have GMOs in it? Unbelievable, but they do. How did that happen? Nobody asked me if I want a GMO in my chewing gum. You know, and so it's insidious. It's everywhere, and it sneaks in more and more places. I mean, fructose is cheap. Corn syrup is cheap. It's the cheapest sugar you can get, and you know, sweeteners is the way to get to people. And so it's everywhere, absolutely everywhere. It's very difficult to go GMO free.
It's true. It's everywhere, but it's very few crops. It's basically mostly corn and soy, sugar beets, alfalfa. I mean, they have not been able to expand their reach. I think all they've done in America, you know, they've been using this corn syrup for whatever it's been, you know, 30, 40 years because it lasts on the shelves for a really long time. So when you're buying stuff with corn syrup, and you're getting like really old food that's made of crap, you know, it's white flour, and you know, it's just not even good food. So it's actually, I think it's easy, you know, if you eat,
Stay away from processed
if you
foods.
stay away from processed foods, and
That's the difficulty. So what do you do when you travel? I guess the sixth thing I would do if I was emperor is I'd make it possible for people to travel and get organic food
that's
wherever they
it.
go.
You've got to have organic food in airports. It's got to be everywhere.
Some of them have it.
Some
And
of them have it,
do.
and we're
In
getting there. But I mean,
San
let's take this
Francisco
hotel.
now, there's 2 places you can get organic food in the airport.
But how about here? What about this week? What are you doing now?
Well, it's interesting here. I actually brought food with me, which I'm now out of. But they did have organic greens in the cafe. They advertised that their salad was organic greens. It said organic greens.
2 over no.
Excuse me?
Their salad bar, they said it wasn't.
That one over there.
Okay, great.
No, where is it? It's over there. The one, they had a sign, organic greens, quinoa salad. So I don't know, maybe they were lying. But I know, I think that, yeah, I know, it is a problem. And I think when you're traveling, you just have to bite the bullet and try to eat what you know, the least damaging thing you
Fasting.
can, like baked potato and stuff like that.
You know, it's about a level of commitment. I have a friend that's been a very, very famous rock star since he was 17. He eats this way, 100%.
But he can afford it.
Well, so can you, because you can sprout. When I've traveled the world and I had no money, you can carry seeds with you, sprout bags, and you can get homegrown, right on you, homegrown foods.
I see another book coming, How to Travel Organically.
I know. The Organic Mover.
I love it.
A big suitcase with all your food in it. That's the secret.
So the point I'm trying to make is not about rock stars. The point I'm trying to make is about preparation and commitment. So again, the last thing I said to you on the list of 5 is become responsible. This is part of being responsible, by the way. Not going someplace and saying, oh, I can't get organic food. If you can't get organic food, you choose. Am I going to go there, or am I going to carry the food with me? Now, all I can tell you is that 6 to 7 minutes in 5 directions here, I get in my car and I go and I buy organic food. And so I have not changed anything I normally do. When people say this is hard to do, no, you choose not to take responsibility. And so you compromise. And once we compromise, it's a slippery slope. That's all I can say.
Jeff made this statement earlier that the corn syrup and all the other junk foods are cheap, and I just want to go a little deeper with that. They're cheap because they're highly subsidized, and no one's figuring out all of the hidden costs that come with this cheap food. So when you consider the cost of diabetes, the cost of obesity, the cost of cancer, the cost of heart disease, there's nothing cheap about it. When you consider the CAFOs, the concentrated animal feeding operations, and this cheap meat and how we can go buy our cheap hamburger, there's nothing cheap about what that's doing to the environment downstream from those operations. There's nothing cheap about the hamburger, and if we had to really pay what it costs to produce that hamburger, it would be something like a $35 hamburger instead of a $1 hamburger.
Exactly.
So this is not cheap, and when the government goes in under the name of humanitarianism into poor countries and offers them cheap GMO seed, and then the farmers find out that they're locked into a patent system where they can't save that seed, and they become serfs to the corporations. They can't save the seed. They have to buy it year after year, and then they have to buy the inputs because the seed doesn't work without the inputs. We're turning farmers into slaves, and there's nothing humanitarian-based about giving people this stuff for free. Drug dealers give kids stuff for free. They don't do it out of the goodness of their hearts. And when we give poor people free seeds, there's nothing free about it, and there's nothing, there's no goodness involved.
No humanity in it.
No.
You got it.
The topic of gluten sensitivity is much more in the public awareness than it was in the past. Have we done something to the wheat, to the barley, to the oats that's different than 100 years ago, that has changed it and made it more glutinous? And if we have, which are the exact grains that right now we should be eating if those are no longer appropriate?
Yeah, I think we have. We've created we have created new strains of wheat that, I have a gluten intolerance, so I don't eat wheat. I had a rash for years. I just had a rash all over my body, and I would go to the dermatologist, and he would say, "You have a rash. That'll be $150. I'm like, I know I have a rash.
Did he at least rub it?
No, he just looked at it. He's like, "Oh, look at that." And then my sister was doing some research on celiac, and she told me to go to this website, and so I just stopped eating wheat and gluten, and it went away, and that was that. I don't know, I got tested for celiac, but I tested negative, and the doctor said, well, it could be a false negative since you haven't been eating it for several weeks, so if you want to know if you really have it, then you should start eating wheat for several weeks, and we'll test you again. I said, no, thank you, I'm fine. But I think that there are kinds of wheat that are less simple, that are more complicated than traditional wheat, that create a problem with people's bodies. And also, when people eat bread now, instead of it rising slowly like it used to, they make it rise really quickly, and people think that instead of the wheat sort of stretching out, it breaks, and so that can be hard on people's systems. And I also think that with wheat that's grown in the chemical agricultural system, that using nitrogen, they think sweetens the roots of the wheat, and so it attracts fusarium and other diseases, and so when that's harvested, then that can be a problem because it's there. And so I think that, I just think there are a lot of issues around wheat. But what's so amazing is now there's so many gluten-free things, like a big thing. You can get everything gluten-free. So.
You have a new car, it's gluten-free.
It's gluten-free car, gluten-free clothing. But they have really good gluten-free stuff now. They have organic rice pasta that you can't even tell that it's not wheat. So I think that all those things that you said are true. It's different kinds of wheat, and the way they're using it, and all kinds of things. And also they spray wheat, unless it's organic, they spray wheat with Roundup right before it's being harvested to desiccate it so that it doesn't mold. And so you're getting a blast of Roundup right on that wheat right before it's harvested and shipped and made into products, which can't be good. Can't be good. So, not organic. Not allowed to use it on organic.
Currently.
But yeah, they're never going to get away with that. But that's another thing. You're also getting not only all the different things that are chemicals that are grown in, but also you're getting this right on it. They don't spray it on the ground. They spray it on the crop itself to desiccate it.
The agricultural anthropologists tell us that this all began thousands of years ago. The original farmers were 8,000 to 10,000 years ago in Africa. Then it moved to Asia 6,000 years ago, and then Europe 2,000, 1,000 years ago. And the hybridization is where it started. So one farmer would say, hey, your crop seems to be more abundant than mine, and so they found ways to marry the crops. So one would be spliced with another, or the apple grower would actually take a branch and splice it on the other tree, and they found ways to change nature. And today with genetic modification, it's bad, but it's that alone. And then the overuse, the one thing that is overlooked with gluten allergies or celiac, it's this consistent overuse. And to your point, Stephen, we don't use the indigenous grains from the geographic locations that we live in anymore. That just like mega industries, wheat became very, very powerful for the countries that control the world. So the British were bringing wheat everywhere, and on it went. And with that said, overuse, hybridization is really why the allergy comes. Now, what the anthropologists also tell us is that wheat used to be about 36 to 38% protein. If you got the best organic wheat in the world today, called spelt or kamut, spelt from lowlands near rivers usually. One was recently found in Egypt, original, and then high, like Montana high or Switzerland, parts of the hills in Switzerland would have kamut growing. They're 12%, and most wheat that you get is 7%. So there's an abnormality in the genetics of the wheat that literally make the gluten, which is a protein in the wheat, much higher, by the way, than what it should be, and it's not in balance. They tell us wheat at one point had all the essential amino acids. That's not so anymore. It's not so.
So what are the specific grains that you advise people who are health concerned in order of your number 1 to your number 6? What is your top grain we should have, followed by number 2, et cetera?
If you're in Europe or North America, the top one would be millet. It's an old traditional grain from Europe. I had a privilege to eat the original one when I was in Europe. Number 2, if you're South American or wealthy, quinoa. Even Uncle Ben's rice now makes a quinoa mix at this point. That's become really hip, because quinoa, these are very high protein, easy to digest alkaline grains we're mentioning today. Amaranth. Amaranth is an Aztec and Mayan grain, alkaline, high protein, lower carbohydrates. Buckwheat, a very, very traditional grain. As a matter of fact, real organic farmers don't use feces of animals unless you want all the problems we've talked about. They take buckwheat in the spring and they grow it and they turn it down, and in the autumn they turn it down. It enriches the soil like nothing. It was a very, very traditional European grain. And by the way, I forget who was speaking here about it, but I learned a lot in that talk right here, that it was even more nutritious than I thought it was. A complete protein I knew, but not as incredibly good in protein as it is. And so we've gone through millet, we've gone through quinoa, we've gone through amaranth, we've gone through buckwheat, and teff, an Ethiopian grain. Teff is phenomenally good for you. Teff is, if you've ever been to an Ethiopian restaurant, which is pretty much a vegan restaurant, they have a little token stuff there that may not be, but their bread is made out of that. Sadly, most Ethiopian restaurants put white flour in teff, but if you've ever had real teff bread, even though it's cooked, it's phenomenally delicious. So if you're going to transition to breads, these are the breads you would take, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. T-E-F-F, teff.
What about wild rice and brown rice? How do they fit into it?
Rice is like soya. It's been hybrid beyond comprehension. Unlike Dr. Clapper, who I have enormous respect for, and the work he's done over the decades, is God knows how many lives he's helped to save. But I totally disagree that soy is a good food. It's not a good food. I don't care if it's organic or not. It's almost impossible to digest. It's loaded with estrogen, and none of us on the planet Earth needs more estrogen today. All cancer basically comes from estrogens, not only breast cancer and prostate cancer. It's indigestible, high in estrogen, not really a great food. So I would strongly advise that you would move over to some other edible foods that are available, are inexpensive, and can be had worldwide. Certainly that's chickpea, garbanzo bean. You know, why we all love hummus. When I was in the Middle East the first time 35 years ago, 40 years ago, I kept saying, you know, what is this with this hummus? And I had a doctor sit down with me and give me an extraordinary story about this. He said, you realize that this saved the lives of people in the Middle East. And now we know that it is a complete protein. It has a wide array of minerals and vitamins in it. And so why we like the taste of it, yeah, it's tasty and it's nice and it's creamy, we can spread it on ourselves, but the reality is it has so much nutrition, your body's still crying out and saying, give this to me. So chickpea is a great one. I'm a big fan of chickpea. And when you make a bean, sprout it. You know, the problems we have with eating beans is we don't germinate it, liberate it, make it more digestible. And sprouting doesn't take some, you know, academic process. You just throw it in water before you go to bed, rinse it in the morning, go to work, rinse it once or twice a day, and in the case of all beans, except mung bean sprouts, 2 days. It's completely done. The tail's out there. And eat it raw, you can make hummus out of it, and if you're going to cook it, that's how to do it. You don't cook it just as a bean.
What about wild rice and brown rice?
Oh, excuse me. I neglected to go into the rice. Rice is the second most hybrid grain or food probably on the planet, soy being number one, rice being the second. Even brown rice, organic rice, not great, filled with arsenic. All of the rice now that comes from the West Coast, California, is loaded with arsenic. Not that arsenic in small amounts is bad for you, it's not. And we can't get away with arsenic. It's riddled on the planet. But wild rice is the original rice. It's like a weed and highly nourishing. I wouldn't sustain on that. I would mix wild rice into millet or teff or quinoa or amaranth. And occasionally eating wild rice is great. And it's not so expensive, by the way, on the West Coast here in the United States. In Michigan, they grow wild rice too, interesting enough. Really great variety of it. And all over the world, they grow wild rice. Red rice is a type of brown rice, just a variety of it. So it's hybrid, quite hybrid.
Brian, everyone, one thing I've heard Brian speak about is fruit has been hybridized. So a lot of us, the word that every single health person in the country says fruits and vegetables. But the question is fruit. If I'm having a seedless grape, am I actually eating fruit anymore, or has it been bred over the last 100 years to be sweeter than it ever was? So in terms of the difference in fruit today versus 100 years ago, is there anything we need to know, because there's some fruits that have been bred so much that they actually have too much sweetness?
85% of the fruit wouldn't have been here 100 years ago. So 85% of what you and I identify as common fruits that you grew up eating didn't exist. These are completely fabricated, quote, foods. That's number one. Number two, we were perplexed because nearly 40 years ago at Hippocrates, we recognized when people had visible cancer tumors where you could see them. They would grow when we gave them carrot juice and beet juice and fruit juice and fruits. And we were stunned because my diet was in great part organic fruit in those days, and lots of carrot juice and beet juice. And we were sort of awakened by a woman who wrote a book after she reversed stage 4 breast cancer at the Hippocrates Institute in Boston called How I Conquered Cancer Naturally. And she happened to be such a stunning case because even today worldwide in mainstream medicine, they'll tell you that they don't really have any long-term life cases with stage 4 cancers of the breast. They don't succeed with this. And so this woman was being observed by Linus Pauling Foundation. And the man who was really directing and running the Linus Pauling Foundation in Palo Alto, California in those days was a former Phi Beta Kappa student of Linus Pauling, the only man in history, and they made a little bit of a bleep yesterday. They said Linus, it was Dr. Gauger that got 2 Nobel Prizes. He may have, I don't know that, but Linus Pauling was the only man that got 2 Nobel Prizes for totally different subjects. Well, this is a man who was running it, formerly a Phi Beta Kappa student of his at Stanford, Dr. Arthur Robinson. And Robinson kept looking at this and looking at it, and he called us and said, hey, you know, tumors grow when you feed it fruit. Now that was completely contrary to what anything had ever said in the history of medical science and research. And I was so confused and perplexed, but we knew we took fruit out of the diet. We immediately started to see a radical shift in the direction that people with cancer had. Within a year, we still didn't know. We were going blind on this, but we took it out of the diet of anyone with any disorder. Viruses, we found out, because my wife's a leading authority on microscopic research, that when you put it in vitro on a plate, on a petri dish, and looked at a microscope and put fruit juice on a slide with viruses, it looked like the San Andreas winds behind a forest fire. It went so fast, your eyes went like bacteria, completely nuts. Fungus, yeast, completely nuts. But the old standard baloney, you know, what they read out of the books, and the biochemist and all these stupid folks, you know, keep saying, well, glucose is burned up by the cell and all of this nonsense. Dr. Steer, who was mentioned in one of these conferences, was a propagandist who was a, quote, nutritionist out of Harvard University, pretty much corrupted the entire mind of the world on, fructose is different than sucrose is different than dextrose. The truth of the matter is, it's now established. It's not only Hippocrates and our work of almost 40 years. The world now, legitimate science knows that all sugars feed all disease. In my books, I write for the doctors, the scientists, and they're eggheads, so I have to write these really boring academic books for them, called Food is Medicine. I have a whole chapter. You want to age prematurely? Eat fruit. And so, bottom line is, what we discovered, as now the German Cancer Institute agrees, Stanford University agrees, University of California, San Francisco agrees, the list goes on. It's just an endless list of people that have become colleagues now in this quest, is that what happens is this creates glycation, and I don't want to get elaborate in this meeting what glycation is, but what it really does is start to create free radical damage, destroy healthy cells. And I don't care if it's organic. Now the second issue, which is actually to me a larger issue, no fruit is commercially, including organic, no fruit is commercially picked ripe. It's an impossibility for them to pick an orange in Florida and ship it to New York without it rotting if it was picked right. All unripened fruit is highly acid. This is one of the reasons we age, why your teeth get bad, arthritics get worse when they're eating fruit, etc. It degrades the tissue of the bodies, etc. And they never ripen once they're off the mother. Plant, tree, bush, shrub. The only fruit that ripens off the mother is a banana. And it's interesting because primates used to, the bad primate, the guy they didn't like, would drag the stalk of bananas and they'd ripen on different days. But that's interesting. The fact is no other fruit ripens. You say, well, it gets soft and it turns color. When we die, we get soft and turn color. It doesn't mean we're ripening. It certainly doesn't mean we're ripening. So you're taking in, so I got with this frustration. I happened to be, by chance, on a plane flying to Los Angeles to lecture. And here, if you're not an American, how we evaluate one another in this country, because we're fairly shallow, we're a very young culture, is we ask each other what we do. My wife, when she first moved here, was sort of insulted at first. I said, tell him you're a garbage collector. It was really cute. And nobody talked to her, and we didn't have to deal with him. And she did. I'm a garbage collector. It's a true story. And they kept saying, how does that girl, how's she a garbage collector? There's a lot of money in garbage, I'd say. So the guy next to me mumbled, what do you do? And to be polite, I mumbled back, I direct an alternative health center in Boston. Well, damn it, his aunt had come to us. And she had reversed something, and he didn't want to stop talking. So to be polite, my mom taught me to be polite. I said, what do you do? And he said, well, I'm an agricultural scientist at the University of California. He was sorry he'd ever opened his mouth. So now I couldn't find one drop of evidence of what I'm talking about now in the medical literature because of people like Dr. Steer and the sugar industry that funds these Ivy League university researchers. It was the agricultural industry. And he said to me, and it's absolutely true, the average fruit today has 30 times more sugar in it than the original fruit. He said, you like crab apples? I said, no way. And he said, why? I said, they're sour. He said, crab apples are hybrids. The original apple was much more sour and fibrous than a crab apple. So what's your favorite apple? I said, Red Delicious. He said, oh, that has about 50 times more sugar than the original apple. And he said, what was my favorite orange? Honeybell. Of course, I like the sweetest ones. Why? Because when I was a little boy, my first experience with drug pushers were my loving parents. When I was good, they gave me dope, cold sugar. When I was bad, they took the dope away. So now I get out on my own. I'm in my 20s and not feeling so good and not knowing who I am and where I'm going. So to reward myself, what did I do? I gave myself dope. So your patterns of addiction. Matter of fact, in my book, I report the latest study out of Princeton where they looked at the brains of people on heroin, cocaine, and sugar. Sugar wins, hand down. It's more addictive, it lights up more of the brain. No wonder it took me 30 years to give up sugar. I lied to most of you for a long time. I gave up meat in a day. Although I love meat, I gave it up in a day. Dairy, I lied for 3 years. I hid in closets and took whipped cream and ice cream. 30 years it took me to give up sugar. I just renamed the sugar. So it was no longer the notorious white sugar. The only time I've ever heard white being bad, but in this case it's bad. I took honey, 98% sugar. Body doesn't care if it's organic, holistic, or I paid 10 times more money than white sugar. It's still sugar it feeds. Then I went, because I was in New England, maple syrup. Well, maple syrup, 65% sugar. You know, a little pregnant doesn't exist. Either you're pregnant or you're not pregnant, that's it. And the list goes. Now, they're really deceptive today. The raw foodie salesman will tell you agave syrup, the raw agave. There's no such thing as raw agave syrup. It comes from cacti. The worst sugar that ever has been placed into a food is agave syrup. It is 90% fruit sugar. Now, to end this, because I don't want to monopolize, although I do quite often, I'm Irish, and pissed off. When you get an Irish guy pissed off, we roll. We occasionally have world leaders who we respect as the #1 authority in the world to come to Hippocrates and speak, and we invite the South Florida community there for free. And a few years, 2 or 3 years ago, we, through a good friend of mine, Dr. Yu, who's a brilliant surgeon and physician and knows more about this than I do. We should have Dr. Yu here sometime. He's brilliant, this guy. He basically called me and said, do you know there's several incredible cutting-edge, ready-to-change-the-world scientists who are all going to lose their job or being beaten up or slandered on the internet and all of that? Let's hold a Love Fest. I said, great, I'm into Love Fest. And so we held Food is Medicine Conference. You can see this on the Hippocrates website, by the way. And we brought the world's leading authorities in science that really want to break through and change. And one guy we brought in wrote the definitive book on cancer that 99% of oncologists haven't read because they still think cancer is genetic. Wrong. So his name is Thomas Seyfried, Dr. Thomas Seyfried, Boston College, formerly Yale University. He's the guy who wrote the book, academic book, Food is Medicine. He said, the book, Cancer is a Metabolic Disease. So we brought him to the Food is Medicine conference. So he pulls me aside, he's an Irish guy, and he says to me, how the hell do you know to get rid of the sugar? I said, it was luck. I said, we started to realize, eat sugar, cancer comes, stop sugar, cancer goes. He said, that was pretty primitive, but it was scientifically valid. He said, sit down. We spent 3.5 hours, and he showed me on paper the work he had done for decade after decade after decade. And he said, out of all the sugars, the worst sugar is fruit sugar. And he said, why do you think so? And I got the first 2 answers wrong, so he gave me the answer. He said, no, the only sugar that acts like fat in the human body is fruit sugar. So white sugar will make you fat. Sucrose, dextrose will make you fat. But this acts like fat in your body. Now, one thing we know to end this conversation is that when you have extra fat in your body, you reduce oxygen. When you reduce oxygen, we've known since 1924, and it's been revalidated by Thomas Seyfried, by 1/3, you now create cancer. All of us every day produce about 1% of our cells as potential cancer cells. Not all of that 1% are cancer, but potential cancer cells. All we have to do, listen closely, all we have to do, besides all the other stuff that gives us cancer, estrogens, etc., is reduce oxygen by 1/3. A great way to do this is drink the amount of fruit juice or carrot juice or beet juice I used to drink. Mangoes. I used to see a mango tree and eat like 10 mango. Watermelons, 35-pound watermelons were my favorite thing at once. You know, God, if you open them, they're going to go bad. We better eat it, type of thing. If you're a dope addict, and you are, listen closely, those of you in the world and you sitting, you are addicts. Until you get that you're a sugar addict, you'll always be an addict. Oh, a little bit of this, a little bit of that, a little bit of that. You are sugar addicts. And so what do we think about fruit? A lot. And now the world of science has finally concluded that what we, by chance, figured out almost 4 decades ago is true. There's a lot of old school people out there telling me I'm wrong. I'm sorry, we're not wrong on this one. We've done 40 years of research, and when fruit's gone, people get well and they don't age prematurely, and when fruit's there, they age prematurely and they get sick and remain sick and grow sick sometimes.
But just to clarify, because there's a lot of people that are not coming for the peak experience of wheatgrass and green juice and green salads, you're still saying that you'd much prefer people to have a Macintosh apple than to have coffee, ice cream, cookies, cake, or any other sugar. So while you're saying sugar itself is, in all forms is problematic, if someone's having low sugar fruits like a Macintosh apple, that's still far better than any cookie, cake, ice cream. Is that right?
Let's reframe it. So I'm not saying that it's as bad to eat an organic ripe fruit. Avoid unripened fruit at all costs at all time. Much rather have an organic ripe fruit. If you're not sick, another caveat, if you're not sick, then I would have processed whole grain donut or a cake. No question about that. But the truth of the matter is, we did the research on that. When we were still in Boston for 30 years, we pretty much had a lot of professors and doctors who would sneak in and say, don't tell anyone who we are. We work at Harvard, we work at MIT, we work at Tufts. And they just were astounded because they never saw people getting well eating vegetables. You know? And it was like shocking to these intellectuals, these extraordinary bright people. And so we would sneak in. One thing we learned is most academics are pretty lazy. So at 5 o'clock, if they were to leave, they were gone at 4:45. And so we would sneak in, and I was sort of an assistant. I didn't know anything other than how to hand them things. And we did some work where we showed the healthiest people among us, so the healthiest people listening to us right now. No more than 15% of your diet should ever exceed fruit that's ripe and organic. So if you're healthy, you don't want to eat more than 15%. Why? Because it spills into the bloodstream, and that's called blood sugar. Don't have to take white sugar to get that. Blood sugar precipitates not only the disorder of low blood sugar and high blood sugar, but again, feeds fungus, yeast, bacteria, mold, cancers, viruses, bacteria. Now, these are facts. These aren't. So why? Because fruit is not the original fruit. 85% of the fruit we have today was fabricated, never ever existed until recently.
Okay, great. Thank you. Okay, so Brett, Deborah, Jeff, why don't you each give us closing thoughts?
Put the microbes back.
Put
the microbes back. That's to me, that's the answer to everything. When you have good soil, you're at the spot where you want to be.
Native Americans used to say that food and medicine were the same thing, and when you took the medicine out of food, you got poison. So I think we need to think of our food as medicine, which you just brought up, and be careful of poison and try to be strong and have a healthy diet and a healthy community, and try to bring your friends and family along with you.
Don't be frightened of everything you're hearing in this conference. This could be overwhelming to most of you in this room and around the world. It would be easy to be discouraged. Let's hope this is provocative, that it provokes you to become you.
It's an honor to be here on this panel, and I want to thank Steve for making that happen.
Hold on.
It's an honor here to be here in this conference with you all, and to have Steve having made this invitation. I probably am the only author here who can say that my book Jabbed exists because of Steve, because he called me and I promised him I would have a book done by the time I came to the conference. So I want to.
It's good. We need deadlines sometimes.
Yes. So I want to thank Steve for that very much. In my other life, I diagnosed mental illness. And by the way, according to the new DSM, we all have several. And, so,
especially this panel.
Yes, but yeah, that we would all have orthorexia, which is coming. But I do want to say that what's odd is that if you go through the DSM, the latest DSM, probably the greatest mental illness that exists in modern history is not in there. We do have OCD in there, and we diagnose, powerful people diagnose other people who collect paper clips and straws and newspapers and magazines and whatnot. and it piles up in the house, and it becomes a big mess, and we can look at that, and we call that OCD, we call that hoarding, and we call that a mental illness. But the powerful people that create the DSM, and the powerful people that give us our food, and the powerful people that take away the rights of other people, the powerful people that steal seeds from others, the powerful people that amass billions of dollars and yet still don't have enough, these are the greatest hoarders in the history of the world. And they have the greatest disease in the history of the world. When Carl Jung talked to the Native American Chief Biano said, when I look at the white man, I look at, we don't understand them. Their eyes are far off, and they're staring off in the distance, and we don't understand them. But we look at them, and we think that they are mad. And then Carl Jung went and thought about that, and he says, you know, there is something really mad about the way we go around the world, and we colonize, and we mission, and we do all these great things to bring development to other people. But he says that in truth, we are birds of prey. And it was... excuse me, I got a note here. Jack Forbes, who was a Native American author and professor, and he talked about Wetiko. That's a Cree word that literally means cannibal. And he said the Cree used it to talk about cannibals who consume others for profit. And all of this stuff that we've been talking about in this conference, whether it's GMO foods or so many of the other things, they depend on us to use us, use our bodies, and to create fear and insecurity in us, and to get us to consume, and and in the process they are consuming us for profit. And if that's not an example of mental illness, then I don't know what is. And that's never going to show up in any of the DSMs, because that's powerful people that created that. But this whole system is based on violence, oppression. In my work, I worked as a domestic violence counselor. I still do that, and I see that a good share of my work is getting people that come in to talk to me, and they're suffering from violence, from the results of violence, and whether a woman is raped, or whether the land is raped, or whether the earth is raped, it's all a violent act. And genetically modified foods, that is an act of violence. We've heard about how you can't get strawberries and mice to make love. Well, you can't do what they're doing in the laboratory can't happen in nature. When you get into genes the way they're getting into genes, that's an act of violence. That's a rape of nature. And we need to look at it in those terms, and we've got to get away from the idea that this is technology and it's science, because if we get back to our natural roots, and we get back to understand what's really true and what's really good and what's really right, we instinctively know that there's something wrong about bringing a strawberry and a fish together, or whatever it is. Nature makes this process work. And when we have the hubris to think that we can take a gene and think that just by taking that gene out of something and putting it into something else, and to think that that's all it's going to do, that's madness. That is absolute madness. You can't do just one thing. And we do not yet know all of the repercussions, everything that's going to happen as a result of what we're doing, but it is a form of mental illness. And I look forward to the day when well, it doesn't need to be in the DSM. We all know it's there. It doesn't need to be verified by the bodies that give us the DSM, because they have some of the greatest sicknesses that are out there. So, thank you.
Fantastic.